I'm Mark Holzer. I'm a professor here, as many of you know, and I'm the executive director of the National Center for Public Performance, which something that I created as a decades ago to try to keep the dialogue going on what was productivity at the time. But then we discovered that productivity is sort of an industrial word that doesn't necessarily communicate everything we were doing about improving public and nonprofit, performance. Or as we might say, what we're really doing is delivering on government's promises. So we are really in the public and nonprofit sectors delivering on what's been written into our founding documents from the Declaration of Independence on, the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, the state charters, city charters, legislation, political statements, et cetera, et cetera. But so many promises have been made to our citizens. Things such as health care or just plain efficient government. So what we are trying to do in this community that's represented here in terms of performance is making those promises tangible, keeping faith with people who pay taxes and saying your taxes are well invested and we're really giving you the services and the impacts of those services, the outcomes that that you expect. So that is sort of our global mission. Now then the question is the details, and as we all know, the devil's in the details. So what many of you do, or whether you're writing about it, studying about it, or actually working at the state, local, or federal levels, or internationally, because we do have several people here from around the world, you're really making these systems work for citizens. We don't think that people know how well they work. We think they're actually working pretty damn well. But what we want to do is involve citizens in the process much more. But we want to be much clearer about what we do. So part of that starts with the data. If we're really dealing with the data, if we are putting the data together in a recognizable way and a clear way for citizens, for the media, for our clients, for anybody who is concerned with public expenditures and nonprofit expenditures parallel to that, and our partners in the private sector, we put that data together in a clear way. Then we can use it to make decisions. So one of the things we want to do with this conference, which is the latest in this series of performance conferences, our 11th in this particular series, which began with the Sloan Foundation, and many of you were involved in, well, some of you were involved in those Sloan projects for a number of years. And I had invited Ted Greenwood, who was the program officer at Sloan, to the conference, but Ted is too busy being retired and volunteering for lots of things. So promised he would come next year. But so what we've done with those projects is emphasize citizen-driven government performance. But what we are now doing is really saying, okay, how do we take the data and work from the data towards performance, not just leaving the data on the table, sort of. So, we know there's a lot of data out there. We know, that we accumulate a lot of this. We analyze it, we talk about it, but what's the connection then between all of this data and actual performance? How are we using it to discuss the possibilities, to identify what the opportunities are? How are we using it really to involve all the stakeholders? And how are we using it to point towards opportunities? So one of the problems that bugs me a lot is that there are a lot of best practices out there, a lot of award-winning programs, and the people who make decisions about how to improve performance know very little about those programs sometimes. But there are thousands of those let's say, random experiments going on. And all of those programs are willing to act as your unpaid consultants. They're willing to really send you the inside information of what they're doing in terms of their documents, their manuals. They're willing to spend a lot of time talking to you if you were only to ask, or if somebody were only to ask about that. I'll just give you one little example. It's a project I did for the state of New Jersey years ago in terms of capital budgeting. And at that point, we were trying to look for large savings. So we identified two capital budgeting programs across the country that were particularly good. One was in Ohio, one was in Virginia. Ohio sent us the manual for free, about that thick. Virginia charged us $25 for it. And I think either one of those manuals or both combined could have saved the state of New Jersey probably tens of millions of dollars. What they did with it, who knows? We delivered it to the Treasury Department. Maybe it disappeared into the bureaucracy. If you remember the last scene of Raiders of the Lost Ark, everything disappears into this huge government warehouse. So we're really here to talk about what goes on in the actual decision-making processes in government and nonprofits, and how do we achieve measurable impacts? How do we achieve increments in performance, progress that we can then communicate back to our stakeholders, particularly citizens in the media and elected officials, which will, we hope, convince them to reinvest in our programs. Because I think, from what I've seen, our programs are pretty good, very professional, and well-run with minimal resources, which is exactly what they're looking for, but they don't know it. So how do we connect data and performance, actually? So we are lucky in today's conference to have partnered with the section on public performance and management of ASPA, the American Society for Public Administration. And I'd like to ask David Mitchell, the chair of the section, to come up there. And David has had the vision to establish this partnership with us, which we hope will continue, I think, and give us more of a national and international reach. And David will be introducing our morning keynote. So thank you very much, David.
Good morning, everybody. As introduced, my name is David Mitchell, and along with Dr. Holzer, I would like to again welcome you to this 11th Annual Public Performance Conference. Outside of my duties here, I'm an assistant professor at the School of Public Administration at the University of Central Florida, home of the undefeated reigning national champions in college football. At least that's what we like to think. And as also the chair of the ASPA section for Public Performance and Management. Our section is delighted to be partnering with the National Center for Public Performance at this conference and beyond to promote public performance best practices in general, and also to better link practice and theory within the field. I think we should take a moment and recognize that there's so much scholarly research that's being done that's never actually applied in practice, and there's so much being done in practice that's never actually studied systematically. So I think we know we can do better at trying to forge that link between theory and practice, and that's a lot of what we're trying to do at SPPM and in our partnership with the National Center for Public Performance. Therefore, I encourage those that are in the field to attend all of the numerous research-based presentations we have scheduled over the next 2 days. Those in academia to learn from the practical experiences that are presented here, and for all of us to further engage in this enduring conversation between public performance practitioners and scholars. And before I move on, I do want to also put in a plug for our section. We're having our first mid-year meeting. And it's part of this conference. It's at 5:30 today on the agenda. And since this is the first time we're doing it, and I'm assuming our membership presence is light, We encourage anybody that's also interested in joining the section or learning more about what we do to attend that meeting as well, and we can kind of have an informal conversation about how ASPA and SPPM can continue this progress we're making on public performance. So with that in mind, it's my distinct pleasure today to introduce our keynote speaker, Troy Schulte. Troy has served as the city manager in Kansas City, Missouri since 2011, but he's been with the city since 1998, fulfilling the roles of budget officer and acting city manager prior to his appointment. His background also includes serving 3 years as city administrator for the city of Marengo, Iowa, 2 years as assistant director of the Benton Development Group in Benton, Iowa. Troy has bachelor's degrees in economics and history from Iowa State University, a master's degree in economics from Iowa State University, and a master's degree in economics from the University of Missouri, Kansas City. And if I recall correctly, also ABD there, right? Yep, got through that coursework, but that dissertation's a bear. I have a personal connection to Troy in Kansas City. He was my first boss in my career. Fresh from my MPA program at the University of Kansas. Any Jayhawks in the room? No rock chalk? Oh, we got a rock chalk back there. All right, good. Troy opened my eyes to the power of budgeting and performance management to transform a public organization. And there's actually an inside joke about transformation there too, but we can talk about that later. Literally asked by the mayor at the time to do more with less, he encouraged us analysts to work continuously in the pursuit of greater efficiency and effectiveness within our assigned departments through operational improvements and managerial innovation. As a scholar, my current research focuses on strategic management and budgeting innovation, or budgetary reform, and those are built largely from the lessons that I learned from Troy and in my time at Kansas City. So since my departure from Kansas City in 2006, I've marveled from afar at the tremendous strides that the city of Kansas City, Missouri has made in pursuit of strategic excellence based primarily on Troy's deployment of innovative performance management practices. I'm excited that he's here today to share his experiences with all of us. And without further ado, I present today's keynote speaker, Troy Schulte.
Do you mind if I dim the lights a little bit?
Sure, and then you just hit which button do I need to, just,
Actually, just.
oh, okay. Cool. All right, we've solved the technology. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here, and I can't tell you how proud I am to see what a young, brash David Mitchell, who joined our office in about 2002, 2001, has turned out. So it's always nice to say I nurtured an academic. Being a guy that barely crawled through graduate school, it's nice to see there's something positive coming out of my existence. So it's a pleasure to be here again. What we want to do is tell you a little bit about Kansas City's story, about our evolution of how we've used performance management. And so we'll kind of walk through a little bit. I should also note that I brought my subject matter experts. Kate Bender and Julie Steenson are sitting over there by David, and I think they're going to present later on at the conference. But again, this has really been a team effort as we try to build into a culture of an organization the importance of data, the importance of performance management, and using performance management as a tool along with just budget size and FTE count, which is, I can tell you, for 20 years in the organization, has always been the predominant default number. The bigger the program, the more FTEs, the more resources they get, regardless of the outcomes that are generated out of it. So we knew that program didn't work. As a budget director, before I became city manager, we would do the annual budget process. I would send David out, I would send Julie out, and I would say, get department performance measures. And they would dutifully go out and get departmental performance measures. We would put them in the budget, we would share them with the city council, and then they would go in the shelf. And a year later, we would pull them off and say, go out and update the departmental performance measures. There was absolutely no interest in the organization in terms of what they meant, what story they were telling, and why they were in there in the first place. In fact, it wasn't very uncommon for a department to just change its performance measures depending if there was a change in staff. So there was no relevance to performance management to the resource allocation. Because it wasn't an organizational focus from the previous city manager, or previous city managers prior to that, that was just a program, it was a road program that the budget office did to make sure that we actually, every year, we won the Government Finance Officers Association a Distinguished Budget Award. That's all it was. And so in 2009, when I became city manager, so those of you doing the math, and I've ever worked with a city manager, that's 63 years of service as city manager, because they count each year, the city manager counts for 7. It's a dog year type of approach. We started to change the culture in terms of saying, well, let's use this issue and let's try to figure out a way to do things a little bit differently in terms of operations of our budget. What we'll do is, this presentation is kind of where we've been, what we've learned, what we've learned and where we're going. And staff put this picture of our What Works City. We were one of the original What Works City member cities. I think the first cluster of 8 a few years ago. And so we were awarded silver status. Los Angeles got awarded gold status, but we think they cheated. They're doing good stuff, but we wanted to kind of celebrate what we've been able to accomplish. And again, 10 years ago, this system was not in place in Kansas City. So here's kind of a history of the performance management milestones, and I'll talk about the issue of the early 2000s when I was the budget director. Again, not a lot of interest in performance measurement. We did actually start to realize that we had value. I started to see the value when the city installed a 311 call system in about 2005. And we started to get a lot of data, and we started to get overwhelmed with calls. Anywhere from 5,000 to 8,000 calls a week come into our 311 call center. It's less when the Chiefs win, and it's more when the Chiefs lose. And when the Royals won the World Series in 2015, nobody had any complaints about city services. But so what we started to do was track that data and look at it and start to say, how do we use this data that we're getting? And a classic example I use is when I was the budget director, I would send staff out and we would ask our animal control folks, well, how many calls for service are you getting? And they'd say, we get very few calls for service. Well, because they were never answering their phone. And it was going to a voicemail. And so suddenly, once we opened our 311 call center, we were getting deluged with phone calls about animal control. And our animal control folks were absolutely shocked. They're like, well, we didn't think we had a problem. We've been pretty much dealing with the animals that we saw. Well, and that was that change of that orientation. And we started to look at this data and start to say, well, why does it take 45 days to do an inspection for a property code case? Why does it take a year to trim a tree, a street tree? Why does it take one district in our public works department 3 days to fill a pothole, and another district that may be in a different part of the city 2 weeks to fill a similar pothole? And it started to open, good data generates more questions than it generates answers. And so this was really the basis of coming up with the basics of our data information system. And so about 2 years into the system, I, as the budget director, said, let's do something radical here. Let's measure how well they do in terms of response, in terms of resolving these cases. We had absolutely no data to go by in terms of, well, what's a standard response time? Is it 3 days to fill a pothole? Is it 10 days to address a property code violation? Is it 24 hours to deal with a loose dog running astray? And so the amount of information we had in the organization was, we had a whole lot of data, we didn't necessarily, they were all over the map. So me and my operations manager, who's been with me for 20 years or more, sat down and said, well, let's just randomly pick some numbers. Let's see how we do. Let's pick a pothole, we'll fill a pothole for 3 days. We had no data to support that number, but it was like, that sounds good. and it started, and then we started to gather that data and just say, well, what does it take for the departments to, and that started debate, and they were like, well, where'd you come up with these numbers? And I say, I made them up. Why did you make them up? Because nobody else could tell me a number that was even more relevant. And so the department directors would go back and grumble about it, but then they started aiming for it. Well, they say, well, here's why it's 3 days or it was 4 days, and they come back with data supporting why they were doing it. And I said, and it began to dawn on us that we may be onto something here from a performance management standpoint. If you give departments a target, they'll either want to prove you're right, or they want to prove you're better than that they're better, or they want to prove that that target was wrong to begin with. But then they start to begin to present data that shows how that information, and it all started with that 311 call center because we simply started to log the calls into the city. We then started to move into some interesting stuff. I think he's now the publisher of Governing Magazine, was the Kansas City auditor for 20 years while I was Mark Funkhauser, and then he became mayor. And he did this annual citizen survey. And he would survey the residents of Kansas City using a scientifically valid approach of surveying using an outsourced firm, ETC, out of Olathe, Kansas. And he would come back with an annual citizen survey presented to the city council that would just bludgeon the organization. Citizen satisfaction with street resurfacing, record lows. We benchmark against the suburban communities. At the bottom of the list. Tree trimming at the bottom of the list. Water services at the bottom of the list. And it began, and he would use that as an organization to just beat on the organization. The media, always loving a good story, would pick that up and say, the annual, what I would call the beating of the city would come up and they'd say, headline of the local newspaper was, city services ranked near bottom in every category. And they wondered why we couldn't get any bond issue programs done or tax issues addressed when this is the predominant response coming out of the local government. Our own local government was, we suck, we're not getting any better, in fact, we're getting worse. And then he became Mayor Funkhauser did. So this bludgeon weapon that he had used to beat the organization into submission was now being used against him. And so he turned to me and said, what if you did something differently with that citizen survey? I said, the citizen survey is not bad. It's structurally, but it's how it's presented and how it's used as a tool that we're missing the boat. So we moved it from the city auditor's office. And I think one of the first steps we did was hire Kate and Julie, and we said, we're going to administer the citizen survey through the city manager's office. And we're going to start to use this data to align all this system data that we're getting with the 311 call center and the citizen survey data and see where there are interconnects and what's the cross connects and what's the data telling us. And so it began a useful tool of tracking, I think, about 70 different services that we track we do it on a quarterly basis, statistically valid, geographically, across the organization, across the city. I think we get about 4,000 aggregate responses on an annual basis. So pretty good response. And we started to blend what are the citizens telling us, what's our own empirical data, and where's the disconnect, where's their alignment, where's their disconnect. And so those started to blend into what we call weekly departmental performance statistics, where I would sit down for 2 hours, I'd have Kate and Julie, and I'd bring the department directors in and we'd work on specific issues. And so we bring the animal control division in and say, all right, you went from having no calls for service to several hundred calls a week. What's your response time? How soon do you get there? How many animals are you retrieving? How many animals are you unable to locate? And we started to look at all that data. We started to bring our neighborhood code enforcement in and says, how come it takes you one inspector, you can do some of these cases, you'll deal with them in 3 days, and another one, it'll take 2 weeks before you get to that case. And we started to look at some of those management processes to say, again, what our customers are telling us is they're not happy with the responsiveness on code enforcement and animal control. So let's start to change that issue and align those issues. Same thing with streets. District 1, 3 days. District 3, 9 days. What is District 1 doing right or wrong versus what District 3 is doing right or wrong? And the realization was that District 3 just didn't make it a priority. Well, we had the most calls for service for potholes in District 3. So we said, all right, this is just simple management. Our residents are telling us your number one priority ought to be fix the streets, fix the potholes. Suddenly the responsiveness went from, District 3 went from 9 days to 3 days. And we saw a corresponding improvement in citizen satisfaction scores. And so that was the starting of the correlation, and the departments began to realize, well, if we can fix this issue, there's a correlation, and then when there's a correlation, I can usually go to the boss and ask for more resources, or I can do types of issues. And we started to look at equipment investments and those types of programs, and it was one of those issues. I used an example of, we did not have a dead animal disposal program in Kansas City, Missouri. We didn't have a roadkill removal program. And so, but when you ask the residents, every time during deer season, and that deer laid out there on the street for 4, 5, 6, 10 days, until it got bad enough that they called the city council member, that was an investment of 2 people. And suddenly the calls to my city council stopped about the dead animal. So we said, call 311 if you see a dead squirrel, or a dead raccoon, or a dead deer, call us and we'll pick it up. An investment of 2 people, a transformational result in improvement in citizen satisfaction and public perception of local government. Again, here was what the data was telling us. Our customers were telling us what they wanted. We were ignoring that data. When we responded, the customers immediately appreciated our response. And all of that led into that department performance management. In 2011, Mayor Funkhauser was not reelected, and Mayor Sly James came in as our mayor, and he wanted to do a Casey stat program, some sort of a stat program. He saw what New York did, he saw what Boston did. He didn't know what that meant, he just knew that we needed to take some of this data management and make it outwardly facing, tell the story to the public, and use it in a way that we could tell the story about how the city was aggressively trying to deal with those service issues. So we asked Kate and Julie and myself to kind of say, help me put together a stat program. And I turned it back to them, and they were telling me last night they wrote this wonderful white paper. I think they referenced Dr. Bain and all the research at the time, gave it to the mayor, who promptly didn't read it, and then said, just tell me how we can make this program outwardly facing. So based on the limited data that was there at the time about performance management, and kind of the lessons learned coming out of Baltimore and a little bit out of New York, we created our Casey Stat program, which was really just a monthly meeting where the mayor and I sit down with the departments on a cross-functional area, and we look at issues. And it started with, why is it taking us a year to trim a tree? Why is it taking us so long to get water main breaks fixed that aren't resulting? People would be really frustrated with the water services department because there would be a water main break. It wasn't causing anybody to lose service, so it was considered a low priority. it would be called what we call a Category 1 or a Category 2 water main break. So we spent all our time and resources fixing the breaks that took people out of service of their water, and we would let that water on the streets run for weeks and months at a time. Well, it drove people crazy because every time they get their water bill, they remember that water just running down the street. So we started to address that, putting in performance metrics, putting in management resources to say, water on the street's bad. Not, there are categories that it's all bad. There's water in the street that people are out of water, that's really bad. And water that's just running down the curb line is bad. We're gonna fix all of them. And if we can't fix it, we're gonna hire contractors who will help fix it for us. Again, we just started to change the management approach of the organization, making it much more customer responsive than it had been the old way of, well, this is how we've always done it. I always said, if I had a quarter for every time somebody said, well, this is how we've always done it. We don't do it that way anymore because it wasn't working. So let's change it and look at it. And I must admit the departments were receptive to it, and those that weren't are now gainfully employed in other cities. But this process took some time, but it took some organizational buy-in. And then as you can see, as we've moved through it, we've continued to add additional resources and capacity to our data management efforts. It started with KCStat. Then we looked at, we moved into open data. We got a lot of Sunshine Law requests for information. Put it out there on the website, let them make it searchable, let them find their own data as a way to reduce our costs. Kate Julie led the effort to say, look at what data is telling us in 311. Are there other metrics that can show us how to put this information together? And that led to data academies where we teach staff how to collect data, how to find the data that they already have and see it as a resource, a process improvement academy. I think both Julie and Kate, I've got a number of other staff, are Lean Six Sigma certified. I think they're black belts or green belts or whatever belts they are. And they go through, and it's that process improvement approach that again allows us to analyze if it takes us too long. And a classic example was one that I'm pretty proud of the work they did. We lined up, what's it take to demolish a dangerous building in Kansas City, Missouri? We've got a lot of urban blight, urban core. At the peak of the Great Recession, we had an estimated 20,000 vacant homes. And so we started to look at our process, what's it take to take down a dangerous building? And we had them go through a process mapping exercise with the department, and we filled up a wall and a half of sticky tape mapping the process of the, I think, 60 or 80 odd steps it took to take a permit, to get a permit to tear down a building in Kansas City. And we said, it didn't take a rocket science to go, there's got to be a better way to do that. And so we refined that approach and have now implemented that approach again, which allows us to simplify the process. Suddenly we got more contractors willing to tear down our dangerous buildings because they didn't have to go through all the hoops. And our cost went down because they had built in the fact that it's going to take me 45 days to just handle all the paperwork from the 6 different departments that are involved in a dangerous building demolition. And so those are the types of programs that we did, and it worked. It started to work, and and then we would tell our story. The other investment we did, along with our data collection, was we invested in communications. One of the big takeaways from this data management approach, this performance management approach, is perfect. But if you don't tell your story, nobody will know what you're doing. They will just assume. Well, I read in the Star, the Kansas City Star 10 years ago, the city services sucked. And that's the last thing. And if nobody else tells me anything differently, I'm going to remember the last thing I heard, which is city services suck. So we started to say, we're going to have to we're getting all this data, we're going to have to ramp up our communications effort to tell people our story about why we're doing what we're doing. And we started to see responsiveness again in that citizen satisfaction survey. I'm pleased to say we've moved all 70 of those categories. Every one of them was on a downhill trend is now on an upward trajectory. And so that's the trend that you did. And you have to not only measure it, but you have to tell that story. If you don't tell the story, it won't matter. It'll be great for us internally, but when it comes to these big initiatives with the public to try to move the city forward, if people don't know what you're doing, they're just gonna fall back on their old beliefs and assumptions. So again, you can see this evolution of thought where we just started with, first we gotta know what we're doing, and then we built that in. We've evolved Casey Stack from moving from just looking at time it takes to trim a tree, fill a pothole, to we were able to convince the city council back in 2014 to incorporate into our city charter the requirement for a 5-year annual business plan based on data. And so we are going through that process every fall of every year where we update our 5-year business plan. It says, here's what we want to accomplish. We then take that to the public and say, here's what we're going to try to accomplish over the next 3 to 5 years. Here are the resources we're going to deal with it. Here's how we're going to deal with our structural balance. Here's the changes we're going to make in operations. And here's what we hope to accomplish. And I use the example of Kansas City or any large organization will never be that speedboat on the open ocean going 100 miles an hour. We hope to be the Queen Mary or the QE2 gliding gracefully into port and enjoying the view along the way. We want to avoid being the Titanic stuck 3 miles down in the mud. And that's an approach that resonates with people. You go out and say, you don't get there overnight. This is not going to be, it's a large city, 317 square miles, limited resources, but here's what we're going to accomplish over 3 to 5 years. And here's the data that says, here's where we are, here's where we're going, here's how we're going to get there. And we present that to the public, and they go, it makes sense to me. And so what we were able to use is through all of this data, we started to our customer engagement approach, looking at resource allocations, focusing on the customer, engaging the customer, and then telling our story. And see if I got the next one. Again, managing with data, what gets measured gets done, all the kind of the simple issues of being able to tell that story about. One of the things that we kept looking at was, I used the dangerous building demolition program. I talked about a year and a wall and a half of processes. One of the things that we also discovered as we watched that number grow in our weekly work log issue through our 311 data was the number of dangerous buildings was going from maybe we'd have about 100. Because of the Great Recession, the foreclosure crisis, we were up to 800 that were dangerous buildings that needed to come down. Separate and distinct from the 5 to 10 to 15,000 vacant homes that weren't dangerous, we had about 870 homes that needed to come down because they were posing a public safety risk. This data and this process improvement allowed us to go to the city council and say, I need a $10 million bond program, and we're going to wipe out that backlog of dangerous buildings in 2 years. And the city council, based on that data, looked at it and said, let's do it. And so they allocated those resources, and then we told the story. So I got the mayor on a bulldozer, the first demolition. He got to knock down the building, and all the media covered it. And every time we knocked down a building, we'd have some sort of media coverage, and it became a big event in the neighborhoods that lousy house has been there for a decade or 5 years or 7 years that all the kids were kept away from was coming down. And suddenly we had a groundswell of enthusiasm that the city was reinvesting in its neighborhood. Well, the city was always willing to reinvest, we just didn't have the data to support that effort. And so we started to see response in those types of issues. So again, when you focus with data and can tell your story, good things start to happen from a resource issue. And then here's the storytelling that I talked about. Once we started to do this outlay and present this information, we started to say, let's go to, we need more resources. We're not going to solve it with just good old-fashioned management improvement, those types of issues. We need more resources. So the mayor and I cooked up an idea. Let's do a big general obligation bond program for public infrastructure. Because every time we would survey our residents, the number one thing they would always tell us is fix the streets, fix the sidewalks. So we said, all right, here's an $800 million bond program. We want your authorization to raise your property taxes for the next 20 years, and we'll fix the streets and sidewalks in Kansas City. We won't fix all of them because 800 million is not enough, but it's a start. And we took the story that we built based on this history of being able to say, we had these issues, we fixed them, we used that data, and the mayor and I and the city council went out and said, we want you to agree to let your taxes go up for the next 20 years to deal with this infrastructure issue. You know what? They approved it, 2/3 of the people voted to approve it. We needed 57% to authorize the bonds, we got 2/3 approval. Because we were able to tell the story and point to them, here's what the data is telling us, here's what you're telling us, here's our proposed solution. And we were able to use the data to tell that story. And so that's what we're working on now. We've done that because of this data management effort and our ability to store. The mayor likes to tell the story. He's 11 for 12 in voter elections since 2011. The one election he didn't get was to expand our streetcar light rail system into an east side, into the eastern part of the city. Because we hadn't built the first phase of it yet, so we didn't have anything to show the residents, so we were a little early. But we've gotten park sales taxes. We've had, most of our taxes are in our general fund come from our earnings tax. And the state of Missouri, in their infinite wisdom 10 years ago, thought it'd be a good idea to let the cities of St. Louis and Kansas City go to the voters every 5 years and say, would you reauthorize 40% of your operating budget? And then they wonder why the credit ratings are potentially lousy. But we've been able to use this data showing, here's what we're spending your money on. Here's how we're working to improve it. And we need 50% plus one, we're getting 82% approval on, again, $250 million of general operating revenue that we have to go in every 5 years. So those are the types of issues where if you use the data, you can use that information and tell your story and get voters to respond. So now we're doing a cross-cutting approach, which is really kind of fun. Then this is something that staff has done. Good managers ought to be able to be smart enough to see when staff get a hold of something and they want to do something creative, the best thing you do is get out of their way. Well, this is an example of where we started to look, our health department started to look at data and realized that there were 6 zip codes in Kansas City, Missouri, our poor zip codes, our poor, and if you looked at a map of the city, all of our dangerous buildings, all of our crime were concentrated in these 6 zip codes. And these 6 zip codes had an average life expectancy of 12 years less than the surrounding zip codes or the citywide average. So we began to look at those, and that's what we're looking at now. How do we align city resources to deal with that broader outcome of life expectancy? And it's moved beyond just saying, how fast can we fill that pothole, how fast can we trim that tree, how quickly can we resurface that street? How do we change the environment? What do we look at for air quality? What do we look at for access to city services? Do we say, in those 6 zip codes, you will have free, if you're a resident of that, you will have free passes, community center passes. So you can work out at the community center. You can have access to public facilities at lower cost. We also did an analysis and said 40% of the city's workforce, the rank and file membership of the staff, live in those zip codes. So how does household trauma, how does neighborhood trauma affect attendance rates, use of worker sick leave, use of workers' compensation issues? We start to see this huge issue of if you can deal with those 6 lowest life expectancy zip codes, your ability to transform the city as a whole starts to make an effect. And so that's been this latest iteration of how data has matured into this process. And that's, again, that wasn't my idea. My original idea, my brainstorm was, let's just figure out how many days it takes to fill a pothole. And then I set the motion in place, and what's really fun now is to see an organization start to respond of 4,500 people saying, well, if we have this data, maybe we can start to change some of these outcomes. And that's what I like to see is, you know you're successful in getting it institutionalized into the organization when staff starts to present the data to you without you demanding it. We're not completely there yet. We still got some outliers. About like every large organization, you always get 80% are going to buy into it, 20% are going to figure out a way to slow it down or fight it out, but we're moving through it. So again, that ability to use data to tell the story, I think is the biggest critical success that we've been able to do, because, and I think that's the balance as you're out in your academic profession, if you talk to these cities, if they're not telling their story about what the data is, how they're using the data, they may as well not do it, because they need to be able to ultimately tell people what we're doing and why we're doing it. So again, we leaned into continuous improvement, doing more with less. We've also started to focus, I always tell them, we survey everything now in the city. So we survey our internal services, we survey our residents, we survey subgroups, we survey neighborhoods. We started to do some employee surveys, just asking how employees feel about working for the city. And always the old assumption was, we'll give everybody a raise, a big raise, and they'll be happy. Sure, that works. I can remember when I was a junior analyst and a former mayor came out and said, we're going to give everybody 8% raises just for showing up. If you show up every day and do your job, we'll give you an 8% raise. Great time to be a city employee. 35 after cutting to fix that structural issue, and there's 35% fewer public employees now than there were before that great idea happened, because you had to balance the budget. And the budget office, David, Julie, and Kate had to all go through that process of letting 35% of the public sector employees be shown the door. We've realized there's got to be a more cost-effective way to give people, and really what they wanted was just tell them thank you. Buy them cookies, show that they're appreciated. And so we've started to do that employee recognition efforts. We do a day where we just buy them at the Worlds of Fun, which is an amusement park in Kansas City. And we buy them we get them discounted tickets. And they can bring their family. We'll get 2,000 people there. And that's one of those types of issues where we start to see a little bit of investment generate huge returns because we ask them what they want. And it's the same issue with our residents. If you ask your employees, they'll tell you every time what they want, how we can be better. And so that's led to some relatively modest improvements in terms of how we do employee recognition, but a huge return in terms of how people perceive their role in the organization and their value in the organization. Lessons learned, I'll kind of summarize here. The one thing we've learned, one of our big takeaways that both the mayor and I talked about when we did KC-STAT was, and it was a lesson learned coming out of City-STAT in Baltimore, was we did not want to do a public kind of gotcha, put somebody on, roast them on their own petard, if you will. Because again, remember I mentioned the conversation about the newspaper and the media love to have the negative story about the ineffectiveness of local government. Well, the last thing you do is broadcast your own weaknesses. You fix them quietly, and we've had more than, and you present the data. The data is, will tell the story. It doesn't take a rocket scientist again to realize what the issues are and how do we move forward and quietly fix that issue without making it a big issue with to embarrass the staff or to embarrass the organization. And that's been a huge takeaway. And suddenly when staff realize if there's a mistake or a problem, and if they're going to be humiliated or professionally criticized, remember these are these people's careers that we're talking about, they're going to be more forthcoming with the data. And so that was the big, I think a huge lesson learned, that if you try to use this as a bludgeon, the organization will clam up, they'll wait you out. And so again, a gradual movement from a more granular operational level where we didn't have the data. Don't ask an organization to drop right in and use data to do strategic planning if they do not know what their underlying data is even telling them from an operations standpoint. You gotta crawl before you run. And then again, I think it's importance of investing in staff skills and systems. And so we've been very good at creating data academies, process improvement issues with a finite amount of staff. I think we've got 5 in that office, 4.5, 5. and I kind of call them our disciples of data. They go out and just try to preach the gospel of good measurement, get people into buying into that, and then recognize that, and they're pretty good at saying, and the boss likes this kind of stuff, so when it comes to budget season, he might be more receptive to investing in it if you present it in a data-driven approach. And by golly, the organization responds. So again, I think those are kind of the lessons learned from how we've done it in Kansas City. Now, I think it's now as, I've been in there 63 years or 9, depending on how you count it. So my tenure, and the average tenure of a city manager in Kansas City is 4. So I'm well past my half-life. I've got a new mayor. I've got a mayor that's term limited after 2 terms. His term is coming to the end, as he says to me, texted me this morning, 282 days, and he will be out of office. And I've got 10 new mayoral candidates and a whole city council changing over in August of 2019. So our conversation has been, how do we sustain this? That given that I may not be there, there'll be a different mayor, there'll be a different city council. How do we sustain this organization going forward? So we've been talking about looking at continuous improvement projects, continuing to get the word out about the value of it. I will take great pride is that in a recent mayoral forum a couple weeks ago, because we're 8 months out from the election, so why not have more conversations about mayoral forums? So I think we've had our 6th mayoral forum already. Well, one of the questions was, and I thought it was to get some sustainability, they asked the council, the mayoral candidates, what they think about performance management and data collection, and all 8 of them, all 10 of the council candidates, mayor candidates, vouched for the Office of Performance Management. They vouched for the city manager. They vouched for the Office of Performance Management, which is what I wanted to see, because that means they recognize it as both internal and external candidates, the value of that statement. So when that has got validity through the performance, through the election cycle, that gets you the key to sustainability, because it won't be perceived as Mayor James' project and it will go away. Which you look at around the country, some of those performance management initiatives have been championed by a mayor or a manager, and when that mayor or manager is gone, that program goes away. What you want to try to do is get that continued investment, that regardless of the administration, and so my hope is that they buy the value of the Office of Performance Management, and they've separated that from that goofy city manager or that crazy mayor, and the value of that organization. So that's the key that we've been working on for the last year. We're going to continue to work on it, but all signs point positively that maybe there's been community buy-in. They've seen the benefit, they've seen the results, and they've seen the satisfaction levels, and they've seen the interest and what I would call the pride in the community that we've been able to reiterate over that process. So that might be the last slide, Kate? So this is kind of where we're at now. Again, I appreciate it. Again, lessons learned, just start, get a champion, push the conversation, and then work gradually to get through it. And I will reiterate what you said was, ask us. We'd love to share our data and have some other set of eyes on it. And we've actually had good luck with, I'll go to the philanthropic community. We got this crazy idea about mapping correlations between, Alfred Ho is a professor at Kansas, University of Kansas, wanted to do a little data collection. He goes, I need some money to hire some academics, and I went to a foundation in town and said, I need $30,000 to hire KU to do a little study of our performance management system. And the guy said, I don't know what you're talking about, but sure. Just show me the results. And so we showed him the results. He got done with it. He goes, does it make sense to you? I said, it makes sense to us. He goes, then that's money well spent. So the foundation community wants to help. The philanthropic community wants to help. They may not understand it, but they know that it's probably good that we're presenting data and helping the local government. So you'll be surprised how many partners are inherently out there willing to invest in this program. That's what's kind of amazing to me, is the amount of interest that we get from the broader stakeholder community. So thank you. I'm happy to answer your questions. I don't know what we got from time, but we appreciate the opportunity. Thank you for helping us do this, because there's a whole lot of cities out there that could use your expertise and your guidance. We made this up as we went along. And I've been fortunate to hire good staff who've taken it a lot farther than I ever could have done it, and are really champions both within the organization and externally. And that's what makes it's fun for the mayor and I to just sit back and go, yeah, look what they did. And we can say, yeah, that's good stuff. Let's keep going. Let's fix issues, and oh, let's see how we can leverage that for a big convention center hotel or a new baseball stadium or those types of issues that we think move the community forward. And that's all where this comes from. So if you get this right, this is the old issue. You take care of the small stuff. I'm a firm believer the big stuff will take care of themselves if you do the small stuff right. This is a classic example. When you do the small stuff right, tell people why you're doing what you're doing, they'll respond and they'll open up the checkbook and let the city move forward. So thank you very much. I appreciate it. Hopefully this was helpful. And if you need a resource, Kansas City is always willing to help. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Lyle Ray, Capital Region Council of Governments in Hartford. Thank you very much. I'm a recovering county manager, so we'll leave that alone. Love to see sustainability here. We could have a long conversation about 3, 5, and 10-year programs that have never been heard of since. I think that's a critical area. Because 2 years on, 5 years off. Oh, thank you. I don't need it anyway. But anyway, but my question to you is the previous slide on moving from granular to strategic. Because one of the things that has concerned me as I look around at performance measurement projects is sometimes they're working on really tiny stuff. The streets aren't safe, they're sort of ankle deep in litter, but someone's working on, petunias in the historic district. So how do you go from, this granular to strategic level? Because I think that's sort of one of the knocks on STAT. Or New Zealand did the same thing. Getting very, very granular, but the big stuff is, for example, a hypothetical city very near my office, 15% of high school seniors are proficient in math. It's not on anybody's to-do list that I can see. So anyway,
Yeah, I think
I just give you easy ones, yeah.
I think that's the issue is I use the gradual movement from a more granular operation level to get the organization buy-in. That they had to see that we were paying attention to their various resource programs. And I'd say we spent 4 to 5 years maybe in that process. And then we were able to get that charter change, allowing that business plan, and then we're able to move into the strategic issues. And we are just now, I think, branching out into those areas that are maybe outside of the direct role of city government. So the mayor is pushing a pre-K initiative because he's got 35%, less than 40% of 4-year-olds are going into kindergarten ready. And it's a huge income disparity. Our more affluent communities, their kids are ready, our least affluent community. And so he's now taking this and saying, I want to do a citywide sales tax to fund pre-K. And he's hit all kinds of resistance in the community. But he's starting to look at that data saying, all right, how do we tackle these bigger, broader issues than just city government? But I share the opinion of him. He didn't have any credibility to tackle some of these broader issues in the community that were outside the role of the city government. If all the opposition had to do is get your own house in order before you come telling me how to do my job. And so he's been able to say, my house is in order. Here's what we're doing right, here's where we're always our continuous process. And that gives you more credibility to have those community leaders. But it takes a leader, somebody that's willing to do it, because there's on that type of stuff, when you got 15%, if you don't directly control and we don't, in Kansas City, the school districts are a separate governmental body. So we don't have any ability to reach in and tell them. He can provide moral leadership, he can pound the podium, if you will, and we can provide back of the house resources and support, but it's that whole issue of, I think having that foundation allows you to go out and do that kind of stuff. But you gotta have somebody that's willing to take it to that next level. Staff probably can't be just because of the structural issues, but you start to beg those conversations. So we're having more outcome-based conversations as a community now based on data than we were 5, 7 years ago. But we started there, and and it was always somebody, all right, we've done that. Okay, we know animal control, we're getting to 90% of our cases within 15 minutes or less. We've got that one issue, we're answering the phone. We're doing pretty good. Now, what's the broader outcome? what are some structural changes we need to do? Do we need to do a trap and release program? Do we need to do those types of issues? And it makes some of these policy more outcome approach issues, and then you branch into those types of management structures.
Appreciate that point. Another word on sustainability, because I think that if we look at the field, I think that's one of the underlying issues that we really need to spend a lot more effort on.
Right. And again, how do we operationalize this so that they recognize that if there's a new manager, if there's a new mayor, when there's a new mayor and maybe a new manager, that 5-person shop is the best investment that city can make. And so that's the key, and that you get that institutional, because I think it'd be bad for the organization to drop back to a situation where the performance measures are put in the budget book, then you blow the dust off the budget book and you pull it out last year, you go, oh, well, look at that number. How many miles of streets do we have? And so that's the issue, trying to make sure that it's embedded in the organization, embedded in the culture of the organization. So if senior leadership leaves for whatever reason, that culture stays. And that's been a 10-year odyssey for us. Okay.
Thank you. I have 2 questions. So my first question is, as I work with nonprofits, I work at the Institute for Public Service, and one of the things that I notice as a deficit for nonprofits is they go through the data management process, but they don't do a good job with documentation. Can you speak to that? And then my second question is, have you been able to leverage other resources like state or federal dollars to assist you once you've been able to tell your story?
The documentation is key, and so one of the issues that a not-for-profit's going to have, one of the issues that we did in the city was we made sure that we controlled the documentation. So data accuracy, data validity is a huge issue for us. So we keep a tight control over. So the 311 call center data, that data is controlled by the city manager's office. That resides in the city manager's office. All the data that report into the financial data is the city's official financial system data. So we don't let departments or organizations create their own data and find their own data, because we become very skeptical of that data. So how do we tie it back into our common data points? And so, and not for profit, because it just inherently, it's going to have that same type of issue. It's not control of the data. And where I've seen the value for not-for-profits is if they can get their board educated, it's a nice way for that board to become advocates for additional resources or capital campaigns and those types of issues. That helps tell that story. I think works just as well in the not-for-profit sector as it does in the governmental sector. As to whether we've been able to use it to leverage additional state, federal assistance, good old state of Missouri ranks 49th in state financial support to cities. So I really attacked a strategy from a Kansas City perspective. Just leave us alone. We'll be fine. Don't preempt us. Don't tell us what we can't do. We'll continue to be an economic engine for the state. Just leave us alone. Same way with the federal government. One thing that data has helped us on is helped us with our some of our consent decree issues. We were under a consent decree with the Environmental Protection Agency for sewer overflows. And so we've been able to deal with, we're also under a consent decree for ADA compliance. And we've been able to use this data specifically tailored to show, here's the impact the rates are having on affordability for our residents. To show we've had a 296% increase in sewer rates since 2010 to fund this unfunded mandate. And it is now, and 20% of my population earns an average of $9,500 a year. And so they are already paying 10% of their median household income on their sewer bill. So that was a powerful argument, even under this administration, to come back and say, we can't afford this consent decree. So we're in the process of getting our consent decree, but it's that data to be able to suggest, here's the impact. It's hard for them to refute it. So we've been able to use it, not necessarily as a way to get more resources, but to get maybe more time and more flexibility in how to address these issues because of the data that suggests here's how the impact is. Here's the impact, here's what we've done. but it's that whole issue. And then we've been able to tell that story that, but for this consent decree, your sewer bills would be much more modest. Your anger really ought to be directed not at the city government, but let your congressperson know about it, let your senators know about it. And boy, that has whenever I talk to one of our US senators, they said, oh, you've obviously stirred up the population in Kansas City because they're calling my office. No? He goes, what do you need from us to make them stop calling? I said, I need some help with the environmental protection agency and Department of Justice. And they're on board because they understand and the residents now know where the issue is. So again, it's that storytelling that is very valuable with that data because it's hard to refute facts. Someone will always try to do it, but the overwhelming number of them will go, well, that makes sense to me. I understand it. Now what are we going to do to fix it? Sir.
Yeah, I'm really glad you got to those 6 zip codes with the low life expectancy. And one of the concerns I had was, as you were going through your presentation about citizen surveys, was the representativeness of that and how those communities that might be subpopulations that have needs are called out. It's not the squeaky wheel, it's the ones. And so as you get into thinking about sustainability, how do you make sure that those eager health department employees aren't the only ones who are mining the data for that kind of thing?
Yeah, I think it's really getting into that cultural issue, and then, what we try to do from a staff perspective is, and what the Office of Performance Management does, is try to present these kind of here's what the data is suggesting, here's an anomaly in the data, what's it mean, and we kind of throw that out to the departments, and that figures that kind of that feedback loop with them, and they start to go, well, maybe it's this issue, and then it drills down into some. And we're starting to see that not only in our health department, but our parks department, our police department started to analyze their calls and looking at how many of their 911 calls are true crime issues or basically looking at, are they calls for other needs for mental health assistance, those types of issues. And so the chief of police was able to use his 911 call data that we helped to kind of articulate the need. Rather than hiring additional police officers, why don't I hire 6 social workers in each one of my patrol divisions that can work on these mental health issues, our chronic high flyers. We have some of our data when we looked at our public safety. One person was responsible for 1,100 calls from an ambulance on an annual basis. At $800 per call, average call for that ambulance, how much resource was that one person taking up in terms of resources? So those are the types of, that data starts to beg conversations about how do we start to drill down and look at those that your citizen survey is not going to get to. It's that raise the issue and then drill down, and you start to look at your top 10 users of your public safety, and they primarily have serious mental health issues. They're homeless. And is there an opportunity for us to get them specific services, get them off what we call the frequent flyer list into a support, and that's how you can kind of reach some of those issues. But you got to I think you got to empower staff to start to use the data to look at it. And this one was our emergency medical director, who's also on staff at Truman Medical Center, which is our indigent hospital in Kansas City. So she was in the emergency room of our indigent hospital. She's also an emergency medical director. And so when the fire chief gave her the list of the high flyers for the fire service, she goes, well, they're my high flyers too. And so then you start to have the impact that, well, if I can help them here, they're not clogging up my emergency, my healthcare system, my indigent healthcare system. So you start to see multiple benefits, but you're doing it at that micro level of dealing with 10 or 15 individuals. And then you can start to get to those, and that global citizen data isn't going to get it to you. And so that's where you got to hopefully get staff empowerment to start to go, well, why is that? Again, I use the example, the data good data should generate more questions than answers. And if it's good data, it will generate a lot more questions, which then generate more questions, which generate more answers. And that's what's kind of fun about this process. You never run out of ways to look at information with the data. Sir.
based on, say, the first 20 such calls?
We actually are putting in place and have, we are waiting on a grant, talking about kind of the philanthropic support of looking at our high flyers to say, will the Healthcare Foundation of Kansas City, which is a not-for-profit based off of the sale of a hospital, fund us basically a licensed paramedic that will sit in our call center and handle, kind of triage those calls as they come in, as opposed to dispatching a fire truck and an ambulance to go retrieve the individual. We're gonna say, he's on our list, we're gonna flag him, we may send an ambulance, or we may send a small truck and get him and take that person directly to the hospital. So, what we created was a little triage center for alcoholic, drug users. We just diverted directly there, and we were able to use state money for that process. So it's all part of that system of putting people in the strategic positions where they can intercept the flow. Because the last thing you want to do is send that $600,000 fire truck and the $250,000 ambulance with 6 people to deal with a guy that's had too much to drink, and he's called complaining of abdominal pains, and he was drunk yesterday, and he called about abdominal pains. And so if you can get them into the process, you're freeing up a whole lot of resources that would otherwise be tied up. So that's the next step, is saying, well, we know we got them, how do we triage them? So putting a paramedic in the call center where the 911 call comes in is the best way to interject at that point and capture that data. So that leads to problem, potential solution, and then we can go out and tell that story and get somebody to fund it.
Hi, I'm Jessica Cullenberg, coming from the city of Chelsea, Massachusetts. So I had a question about your comment on the importance of teaching all your staff to collect and analyze data. So I can think in Chelsea, I think there would be a lot of resistance if we brought that up to the staff. There'd be sort of like a lack of enthusiasm, or kind of wondering why they have to go to something like this. So I guess, how do you incentivize your staff to sort of gain an interest in collecting and analyzing data? And if you can talk a little bit more about what that process looks like, if you bring in like an external consultant, or what you're actually training them on, because I know data collection's a big range of things. So if you can talk a bit more about that process of training staff to collect and analyze data. Thank you.
Well, I might ask Kate and Julie, but in the broader issue, what we do is we do not make it mandatory. Nothing will kill interest in a program when doing a mandatory training. You got to do mandatory training for sexual harassment, all the discrimination issues, and nobody likes to go through that, but it's required. What I didn't want to do was make it mandatory data management training. So we try to respond to those that are interested. And it's a small group, maybe a half dozen, maybe 10 people at the most. And again, what we found is, I think it's some of our more aggressive, kind of career-sided folks that kind of want to climb up through the organization. So there's an interest in it, and it's a quick way for Kate and Julie to tell me, hey, there's a really sharp person in the Parks and Recreation Department, and suddenly the city manager now goes, oh, we got an entry-level analyst in the Parks and Recreation Department wants to do some creative things, and you start to, and so the really aggressive ones see it as a career path opportunity, and if they're interested, and it's genuine, they go through this process. But Kate and Julie, you might want to elaborate a little bit more on that process.
Yeah, so, I mean, for us, Data Academy was not something we came up with as, well, here's another way to drag staff into it. It was actually a response to a need. As Troy mentioned, we had great buy-in, mostly across the board for department management, and even for the mid-level managers, deputies, division managers. But the thing we were seeing as central analysts was a lack of capacity to respond. We taught a bunch of people about the importance of asking data-driven questions, and in some areas, there's no one to provide an answer on a regular basis. And so our response was, well, let's offer this. And as Troy said, we've had a lot of just people signing up, haven't even had to advertise it that much. I'm actually offering the 4th cohort right now. And we've had between 20 and 25 people go through each time. And I think the other thing is it goes, especially at the first couple classes really were a lot of true analyst staff, or people who are more or less acting as analysts without the title. The farther it's gone, we've really kind of covered that initial group of people who are assigned data tasks, and we're getting to the people who are receiving analyst tasks but really don't have as much capacity. And I think that goes hand in hand with a focus on employee engagement, because we're also consistently trying to focus on delegating to the front line and empowering our employees in their day-to-day work. And so really a focus on data kind of is hand in hand with that, because it's saying you're crucial to this person, that you as a frontline employee who's the one actually collecting the data. Here's why it's relevant. Here's how you can be involved in it.
Take one more question back there, and then I'll ask.
For example, how many women or men, when is the 911 calls, how many women or men go through the mental health consultations and so on?
What we have, based on the initial data, is most of our high flyers, it's evenly split between, our chronic users are evenly split between men and women, to the best of our knowledge. Some of that data gets aggregated up, and specifically, we get into HIPAA issues if we go too granular, but the data suggests it's an even split between female and male. And our call volume into 911, the last data I saw says primarily women use that. And so how do we try to figure out a way to, again, do that? And that leads to a communication outreach. Is there a better way to deal with it rather than hiring dispatchers? Can we find a different communication methodology to get to those potential folks that we can then take the pressure off that 911 call center? We don't want them to not call 911, but if it's some of those types of issues. So again, the questions, the data leads to more questions, and it leads to more opportunities to kind of tailor a program and deal with some of those issues. And so that's what's kind of fun about this, is you start to get more information. You start to say, well, what if we tweak this program a little bit differently, or created a diversion for those individuals? And so it's led to, we've got a group that of our police department's now going to co-locate with the State Office of Child Assistance and our metropolitan organization, a not-for-profit that's involved in trying to combat sexual assaults. What if we combine them into a single facility? Governmental enforcement, governmental assistance, and not-for-profit assistance, and put them all together, and then what sort of outcomes do we see out of that process? So again, a conversation of not looking at this on a silo-based approach and saying it's strictly an enforcement issue. How do we put all the stakeholders around in the same building, and we're able to leverage that for, it's about a $30 million building. They're going to go out and try to, they already got 2/3 of it raised, because people like, well, I like that idea of being able to put all our people in one location, so it's a one-stop shop, if you will, for a victim of sexual assault. She'll have child services there, she'll have enforcement abilities, she'll have municipal court prosecution, domestic violence. All of those functions will be in that same facility. All that started coming out of that 911 call data, looking at it going, maybe there's a different way to deal with this type of issue.
So before we let you go, Troy, I wanted to ask Troy and Kate and Julia, actually, where all these lessons learned come from. So, this is a pretty good synthesis of what we've been trying to develop in the field for a long time. But did you develop this sort of on-site inductively? Or, to what extent are you reading our literature? So journals or books, Bob Bain's books, for example. What extent does the research we do and the insights we try to come up with inform this, or are you really developing this from the ground up? Or so?
Well, I can give you a really direct answer to part of that, which is that, and this is just a very serendipitous thing to be at this conference and have Troy speaking and having Bob Bain speaking. When we went to develop KC Stat in particular, when the mayor came in and he had heard about STAT programs, and we had as well, obviously, and he had the good grace to say to the city manager, okay, I'm fine to have your staff develop it as opposed to having his staff really own it. So Troy said, can you develop this program? And in response, we were like, where would we start with something like this? So I actually went out and started searching and was familiar with Bob Bain's work and came across his white paper, The 7 Big Errors of Performance Stat. And I literally took that white paper and I turned it into a white paper for the mayor about how we plan to address all of the potential issues or errors with our program structure. And so, I very literally shaped Casey's stat around that research. As I was talking about this last night with the same manager, I was like, that was probably way overkill. I don't think the mayor cared at all. But it really, a lot of those, and I think that first bullet point there was one of the ones, as it happened, the mayor and the city manager were already there. They wanted a collaborative approach, but it was really helpful to be able to look to the research and say, that's also what the research says is the right thing to do. And there were other small things that, again, with our structure, and we've really carried forward a very consistent structure. Casey Stat's been in place for 7 years, and it has really been very consistent in the structure since then and has worked well. So, yeah, so the research definitely has played a role for us.
So we're encouraged by that.
Yes.
And the lesson is buy Bob's books, right? Okay, so David?
Yeah, I think we have something to present, Troy, with here. Just a thank you token for all of your great contributions, so appreciate it, and we enjoy the address as well.
It's a pen I can't chew on, so that's great. Thank you, guys. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. So we're going to take a short break here until 10:15 when we'll start the first panel. Okay?
Hey, thank you everyone again for being here. This is our first panel session of the day, and this is generally the format besides the keynote that the rest of the day is going to follow. My name is Andrew Ballard. I work at Rutgers University, and it's interesting. David, Rutgers is actually also the current reigning undefeated champions in collegiate football, and we have some friends from Michigan, and in November I look forward to delivering a devastating loss to the Wolverines. Which side loses, we really know the truth of that. So
good luck. Go blue.
So what I actually do at Rutgers, besides watching us lose every single football game we play, is I study how people working in the public service see and interpret the data that's put in front of them, because so often is the case that an analysis is done, a report is created, and then there's a transaction of data. That data is handed off to someone, a decision maker. And in that, there's an enormous gap that we've observed. And the problem is, which so many of you are probably frustratingly aware of, is that once this analysis is conducted, regardless of how rigorous it is, the big question that's presented is, well, what do we do now? What do we do with that information? And there's sort of cognitive failures that we observe, and that's the area I study, heuristic behavior and biases in the way people see information. But I think also a large part of that gap has to do with the organizational culture. Is the organization willing to change? Are they willing to accept that information? We've already touched on that today, and I'm particularly interested in that problem and that issue, and I'm very excited. I think a lot of these presentations today sort of provide you with tools and address that issue in their own small ways, and I think this is going to be a very interesting panel. So as a sort of house cleaning and logistics, each presenter will get about 15 minutes to give you their presentation. I'll be giving them cues as to what their timing is, and then we're going to try and reserve as much time as possible, 20, 25 minutes if we hustle at the end of the presentation for Q&A. I'd like to prioritize audience questions, but I'll have a question prepared if need be. And so we're going to start with Dr. Julia Beckett. Julia Beckett is a professor of public administration at the University of Akron. She teaches courses in org theory, public law, program evaluation, and she also publishes in the area of public finance and budgeting and public law. And she earned a JD from Washington University in St. Louis, and her PhD is from the University of Colorado at Denver. So please welcome Dr. Julia Beckett.
I don't have any overheads. I'm just going to talk to you. First time I was involved in data collection in the public sector was when I had a summer job putting up street signs and painting the streets. I was the person that sat at the back of the truck putting cones down. And of course, my sister looked at me one day as I was driving down and yelled, "Conehead." Okay, that was one of the nicer things that got yelled at me. But the person who was directing that department tracked the information, never heard anything about it. And I always like to know how things work. I really enjoyed budget classes because they took information and tried to make it relevant. And unfortunately for my students, when I get to teach budgeting, I start out saying, "How many of you are comfortable with numbers?" And I get a lot who say no. And so I do the mean professor thing. It's like, if you're not comfortable with numbers, maybe you should be in another career. You gotta be able to understand the budget. You have to collect data. And if you aren't comfortable with these things, you have to be able to at least be comfortable to talk to the analysts who will provide you this and be able to use it. And so the idea of budget, program evaluation, how do you talk to students about what's there? Over the years, I have looked for information. I've looked for consistent use or availability of budgets by local governments. I can't find them. I've looked at the CAFRs. Ohio at least has a database of those, but it's basically like looking at paper reports. Trying to search between them doesn't work. The person I worked with said Missouri doesn't even bother to put them online. They just archive them someplace. That was a few years ago. I don't know what they do. But I keep hearing about big data. And so I was trying to figure out what the current guidance of use of big data in everyday management. So I did a literature review to see what was commonplace, what was out there. Not really looking at reporting big data. Trying to figure out how big data could be useful in management. So I'll give you the thumbnail, the short answer, and give you a little details later. So I asked, how is big data being represented as useful for managers? Promises. Is there established wisdom or guidance given for managers to organize and use data? Well, not exactly. Were there useful examples that I could provide to my students or sources to look to think about big data or how they can apply data in management? Well, not really that I could find. So I did the lame thing. I looked at Google Scholar with big data in quotes, over 87,000 hits. I looked at the first 5 pages, and there were multiple ads. Most were for computer and IT journals, and those that were on government were talking about that could use it for policy, could be used for decision making. Looked at Brookings, got about 210 hits, and I got some blogs and research memos. Looked at Urban Institute, got about 49. Some were blogs and short stories, some were reports. And if you've looked, Urban has really cool data visualization. I'll talk about that later. IBM Center for Business of Government had about 90. Most were blog shorts and weekly roundup. There was some interesting stuff there. ICMA talked about open data and performance, data analytics, smart government, but occasionally they'd mention big data in the articles. Governing, depended which day I searched. One day I got 280 hits, the other day I got 310 hits. They were talking a lot about promise, some examples of management, a number of links. Pew, 749, but then I realized they wouldn't let me search big data, so I got anything that had big and data in it. But Pew has some really good stuff on performance starting in 2013. And they had a data as strategic asset initiative for state governments. And as soon as they reported or issued their report in February, they shut down that initiative. As you probably know, that President Obama was the big data president because he declared in 2012 that he would have a big data initiative. The purpose of this was for research and development. There were over 300,000 data sets. I've heard people talking, yeah, you can get them at data.gov. There were some interesting examples of how they were used. Of course, this has shut down. Some of the purpose of this was he wanted to demystify, he wanted it available for use for public transparency. The difficulty with big data is how do you define it? And the definitions that I've seen are, multiple paragraphs. And so let me simplify. Big data, well, here I'll read you a quote and then I'll simplify. Big data is a phenomenon defined by rapid acceleration in the expanding volume of high-velocity, complex, and diverse types of data. Big data is often defined among three dimensions: volume, velocity, and variety, or as I wrote in the comments, blah, blah, blah. It looks like the first page of an academic research paper that gets published. Big data can just be the large amounts of information within one data set. Think of the census. Or it can be the fact that you have multiple big data sets that you can use to interact and find information. Those are probably the two simplest. And then the last one is big data is that it's a topic of conversation. Forget the last one. But think of massive amounts of data and complexity. Most of the thing I found about big data, potential and promise. Many of the early ones are talking about how wonderful big data could be used. It could provide us new social science insights. It might be able to tell you where the problems are. I know cops. They'll tell me which area of the city has the highest number of problems. I talk to teachers. They'll tell you which neighborhoods and kids need the most use. And so at least within one city, the big potential, I was not so sure. The difficulty with big data as a term is that's confounded with data analytics or analytics, data science, smart cities, open data, and sometimes, thick data, predictive analytics, predictive analytics, and sometimes performance measurement. I prefer performance measurement aspects of big data. And some compare that you need to start with little data rather than big data. I worry about words and the emphasis on data rather than management information or something that's usable bothers me, and the idea of data right now seems to be a term that substitutes for performance and management. Often the discussions assume data exists or the data is same as information, that it can be manipulated to produce value or policy. And so as I'm reading through this, I'm thinking, how do you store the data? How do you make it usable? Who writes the questions? Who writes the algorithms? And it seems to me with data, any success depends on how you store the data and what type of questions you ask. And as the earlier presentation, 20-year effort to try to do it requires consistent type of attention. Most of the discussions on big data say it's useful for policy, it's useful defining social programs. What could I find that was useful for management? Well, most examples were related to place-based activity, that is data connected to GIS, or most of the success stories. Policing, locating and predicting high risk for fires, those types of things. One interesting example was some states are using real-time reporting of accidents or dangerous locations on the highways to try to inform highway patrol. So real time, rather than just eye in the sky morning commuter warnings, that it was scoped, that they had the information statewide and they could use it. I'm running out of time. The big success story is definitely the CompuStat Performance Stat, policing and geography, NCIC. The reporting system has long existed as far as what police are doing, and so they had that system up and going. Public health and epidemiology, long history of mapping outbreaks. Some of the thumbnails: reporting of accidents, conducting predictive analytics and parcels, high risk of being abandoned, types of things. There have been a couple large surveys. Short in urban talked about how 280 cities were surveyed about police, public works, code enforcement, and the report unfortunately said it was used. I didn't get anything more than that. Ho has done some interesting stuff, study of 65 cities. Pew interviewed 350 people and state use of administrative data. And the idea that the information that cities like Kansas City collect is seen as administrative data. One of the concerns I have is kind of the data to information gap. And I think managers are making the information available and usable to them. It's just not being discussed where I could locate it and give it a good example. Another concern when I raised to this is the locus of expertise. The talk of big data needs a centralized chief data officer, chief resource officer, versus is it dispersed with experts in departments, contractor collaborated. I agree with the Kansas City and with the Bureau of the Budget in, 1940, that they linked the performance statistics information with management and tried to make sure the different organizations and agencies could use them. This big data discussion with a chief data officer, chief research officer, is reminiscent of the development of policy sciences, development emphasis in town and gown. I'd rather see it operationalized or applied. It's undeniable. Management needs information. They need knowledge gained through sophisticated methods. And so I'm wondering, are we teaching, or am I teaching my students on what they need to know, or how they can talk with these statisticians or folks to be able to help move the big data? And so let me talk about some of the cool stuff that's out there. ICMA has put together a key performance indicator open benchmarking spreadsheet. Cities are putting that information. That's kind of interesting. Urban Data Viz is really fun for entertainment. I don't know how usable it is, but it's something that you can see how data changes over time in particular areas. I send my students there and I ask them, please write how you think this could be useful for a local government manager. I haven't found anything interesting yet in those reports. I'm running out of time. Visualizing data, the What Works City Bloomberg Initiative, the Open Cities, the training. There are free classes on data science now that you can do. I have 1 minute, and I'll use more than my 1 minute. What's not mentioned? This data, if it's kept in the city manager's office, becomes a public record. It's accessible through Freedom of Information or a request. Is it a mix of public or proprietary? The idea of protecting individuals sometimes comes up, but with Google searches, quite often you can identify individuals without name just by pulling up some of this data. the idea of working with experts, that the government need to work with consultants or academics when they're using big data projects to perhaps be useful. And the last is that data must be analyzed and discussed in a narrative. It's a sandbox on its own. It really doesn't have a lot of meaning. It has to be collected and organized and used. And so the big data right now is still a promise, and I am going to continue moving my students to thinking about how do you gather data to actually answer a current management question and leave big data to folks who are trying to publish papers. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So our next presenter is Jason Coupe. He's an assistant professor at NC State. His PhD is in strategic management from the University UIC, University of Illinois Chicago. And he has a BA in economics from the University of Michigan. So now we know why he said go blue. So please welcome Jason.
Hey, good morning, first of all. Go blue. As an alum, I can say with some confidence that the University of Michigan football team won't be losing much sleep over its visit to Jersey. So, oh, there we go. Cool. Welcome. So we've been doing some work thinking through how to measure efficiency of public agencies and nonprofit organizations. So it's a little bit of a black box, so we found in the literature, and talking to managers of nonprofit and public agencies, nonprofit managers of nonprofits and public agencies. So this is part of a bigger project, sort of unpacking that black box in terms of what tools can be used for what to measure efficiency specifically. All right, so we're going to compare two methodologies here. Data development analysis and stochastic frontier analysis. So just sort of what's coming. As you know, efficiency is of concern to public and nonprofit managers. You want to know, so we define efficiency here really as broadly what you do or make with what you have, right? So your inputs relative to your outputs, right? So thinking through what the relationships between inputs and outputs are. Nonprofit managers want to maximize the social output of every investment. Same thing with public managers. You want to be able to have the biggest impact you can with what you have, right? The problem is there's been very little discussions about how to measure efficiency. We've got some broad ideas about typically what works, but we're trying to unpack that black box in terms of what's most useful for what tools are most useful for what purposes. All right, so again, we're concerned with the degree to which organizations can turn inputs to outputs. The two biggest most popular ways to measure efficiency are data development analysis. This is a mathematical linear programming technique, which essentially amalgamates your ratios of inputs to outputs. So it's great if you use lots of things to do different things, right? If you're a public manager and you're responsible for 6 or 7 or 8 or 10 different metrics, DA composes a single score of productivity based on as many measures as you're responsible for, as you tell it. And stochastic frontier analysis is an econometric technique. So if you look at the organizational literature broadly, there's a lot of stuff sort of saying, oh, SFA is better, DA is better, SFA is better, DA is better. But in the public management literature, there hasn't really been a walkthrough of when to use which tool, right? All right, so again, we're sort of comparing DA and SFA. They're well-known advantages and limitations, but they're not present in the public management, nonprofit management literature. So Habitat for Humanity gave us some really cool data. I suspect they'll want us to do something useful with it, but right now we're just doing academic things. So we were able to use, they gave us data, input and output data and financial data for all of their affiliates, all 1,400. We used data for the 795 with revenue over 25,000 because those are the affiliates that we got good, useful financial data for. And so we ran both DEA and SFA with the Habitat data and used the opportunity to sort of walk through what the data was telling us about Habitat's efficiency, what each methodology was telling us differently. So we're at the beginning stages of this. And so I'll conclude here with some basic tips on when to use sort of each procedure, all right? So what we did with the study is, again, we used 795. I'll go through the inputs and outputs that we use in a minute, but we ranked each affiliate's efficiency sort of 1 through 795 using both tools, and then measured where the rankings will be different. And we're in the process of sort of thinking through why that is, all right? Okay, so we use both DEA and SFA. So just a basic walkthrough of DEA. It's a mathematical linear programming tool that computes this efficiency score denoted as theta with, in the numerator, a weighted ratio of outputs, and in the denominator, a weighted ratio of inputs. Typically, efficiency scores are constrained by 1. So your most efficient organizations or affiliates will be noted as 1 or 100% efficient, and then the least efficient ones will be ranked by the distance that they are from their most efficient one. So it'll be 79% or 63%, et cetera, et cetera. So basically all we're doing is changing these weights in the denominator and the denominator to compute the score. All right, and that score sort of tells you what your benchmarks are. So graphically, it can be represented by this. Right? If you think of A through E as organizations that you're interested in comparing to each other, right? Efficient organizations A, B, C, and D would be on this efficiency frontier, right? They would be denoted as efficient. And E would be some distance from that. So DEA measures the distance. In this case, it would be between B and C because it's its two most closest peers, and assigns a percentage that goes, hey, you have 23% more efficient to go to sort of catch up with your peers. All right, but there's some details there that we'll walk through in a second. All right, so for DEA, Habitat gave us 2 critical inputs that they have. They were both expenses, so they're program expenses, so what they spend on programming, and then their sort of overhead expenses, right? So their management and general expenses, stuff like staff salary, salaries of the CEO, capital, et cetera, all right? The organization told us they had sort of 4 critical outputs, right? So the first was the number of new homes they built, the number of homes they rehabilitated, the number of homes they recycled, and then the number of homes they repaired. So those of you who know, Habitat for Humanity is a major sort of multinational nonprofit that helps provide housing for low-income citizens in the metropolitan areas they serve. So again, we use DEA to measure efficiency with these 2 inputs and 4 outputs. Then we did was stochastic frontier analysis. Very different procedure, night and day. So what we did was combine the outputs to have a total measure of sort of housing activity by Habitat. And we did that because stochastic frontier analysis is essentially a regression. So we can't have more than one output, can't have more than one DV. So we combine them to have a total output measure, right? And then we said, what is the impact of program expenditures and administrative expenditures on that output? What SFA provides is this efficiency measure. So it kind of makes sense, right? So here's what you make, your houses. Here's what you use to make houses. And then your terms here, how good are you at using those inputs to make outputs? And these are where the efficiency scores come from in SFA. So again, we use both procedures to rank efficiency of Habitat affiliates. All right, so there's the sort of that's the output that stochastic frontier analysis provides. So if you could just sort of walk this through, a 17% increase in, a 1% increase in administrative expenses increased housing output by 0.17%, right? So it gives you sort of how productive are your inputs, but then also these efficiency scores. So then we'll go, how efficient are you basically? Okay, cool. So we found that the scores with DEA and SFA were mostly correlated. So they mostly told you the same thing, right? If an affiliate showed up as efficient with DEA, on average it showed up as mostly efficient with SFA. But as you see, they aren't perfect, right? So these are DEA efficiency scores, and these are SFA efficiency scores. What's interesting is this little bunch down here. So there were a bunch of affiliates that DEA said, these affiliates are performing really well. The SFA said, these affiliates are not performing really well. And we wanted to think about why, since they were using both the same inputs and outputs, thinking that it might tell us something about when each procedure is useful. All right, just sort of walk through that a little bit more, right? The top ranking affiliate, so the most productive Habitat affiliate, as measured by SFA, made 33 new houses, and this will be important in a second. Only recycled 1 house, rehab 53, and repair 295 for a total of 382. So a high total of, this is one of the most active nonprofit affiliates. But DEA only ranked us 43rd, despite having this really high output measure. All right, the top ranking affiliate by DEA had a much lower output, right? They only rehabbed one house and they repaired 25. They didn't make any new ones. They just did those two things, right? But it came up as the most efficient affiliate by DEA. And we'll sort of talk through why in a second, right? Stochastic Frontier Analysis ranked as the second most efficient out of 795. So efficient by both, but you could see two very different affiliates in terms of activity, in terms of what they do, probably in two very different cities. So we're sort of banned by IRB from telling you what they are. I don't think I remember anyway. But two very different habitat affiliates, right? And so thinking through the differences in the methodology might tell you something about which performance tool might be more useful, all right? So again, the outliers are the ones that are telling us that, we think, right? So these organizations here, these affiliates that one methodology is saying is really efficient and the other is going, this is only 600th by SFA, but it's something like 80th by DEA. So why you see that big divergence? The big reason is weights. All right, so what DEA does is it weights each affiliate on what each affiliate does well really highly. All right, so if you do a lot of one thing, right, as in the case that was the top ranked affiliate, it did a lot of housing repair and did nothing else, right? So DEA ranked their repair of houses really high. So it saw it as efficient and said, well, clearly this is a mission of yours, and so it compared it to other ones. SFA doesn't do that. It simply just goes, what is the total of what you did? And that can be a misleading thing, right? Because sometimes the totality of what you do doesn't really represent what you're good at, right? So SFA is good for sort of amalgamating how much of what you did, but DEA is a really good tool for sort of parsing in and thinking through measuring efficiency in a way that highlights what you do well, all right? So that's sort of what we're thinking through, right? DEA and SFA are on average similar, but sort of walking through the differences parses out these two things, right? DEA is really good for multi-criteria decision making. So for the public and nonprofit sphere, we don't have these single unique measures like profit, right? Where you can sort of say who's doing what well and what isn't. DEA allows you to parse those things out as long as they're quantifiable and go, the affiliates that do the same things well will be compared to each other, all right? So it's a strength of the tool, right? And you also can have multiple inputs and outputs. You don't have to have the same thing. You could have 30 different things you're measuring, or 100, or right, as long as your computer won't crash. You can plug in sort of infinite input and output ratios into up to your computing power with DEA, and the program will typically solve it, all right? Assuming some other constraints, which I didn't really go into. So again, it highlights what some units do well and what others don't. It's also less constrained production function in the sense that you could use a lot of different output and input ratios. All right, DEA does have two drawbacks though, which we didn't really go into, and we're gonna spend some more time later in the paper sort of parsing this out. DEA doesn't model statistical error, so you can't really think through the degree to which DEA might not be measuring what's really happening statistically. So we take your data as your data, right? There's no way to think through the error there. That's the most sort of pointed drawback to DEA. It's also highly sensitive to outliers. So the way that I'm determining whether or not you're efficient is by comparing you to your peer. If you have a really efficient or inefficient peer, it's gonna change your score, right? So if two of you are really inefficient, one of you is gonna look really efficient because you're just the most efficient one. So what the most efficient, how far this frontier is out, right, sort of changes your performance score. So it's a drawback, right? What the measure of E is depends a lot on what the measure of B is. So you have to know that going into it. SFA is great for modeling error, right? I can sort of think through causality a little bit better. I can model time better. So how efficient you were yesterday, how much does that determine how efficient you are today? And learning precisely what inputs should matter most on average. So DEA, because it's a regression, you can get these nice sort of regressionary tools that go, well, if I increase administrative expenditures by X%, how much output can I expect on average? And then the same thing with program expenses. So SFA is really good for that. The problem is it can only really model one output at a time. So you'll either need to break out tools for each performance measure or combine them in some useful way, which can be tricky. A lot of different things that we do in the public sector can't be sort of usefully smashed together. So DEA is the most popular of both tools, but because of its drawbacks, some folks will use SFA either to triangulate it or as its own measure. All right. So if you have multiple ones, you'll need to sort of break them out separately or combine them in a way that's useful. There's some tools for that in the literature that after this, if you want to talk about it, I can sort of point you in the right direction to. And then sometimes, right, neither of the tools, neither of the ability to combine or break them out can be useful, right? So SFA only really works when you have that one, works well when you have that one thing that you're sort of targeting that you want to think through performance on. All right, good. So the big drawback seems really obvious, but DEA and SFA both have weaknesses and strengths, which the literature tells us, but we need to sort of be very careful about what those weaknesses and strengths are and what they can tell us about our organizations, the organizations that we manage, right? So if possible, most people will do both as performance measurement tools, efficiency measurement tools, and sort of walk through what each does. All right, and then there's my contact info. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Jason. That's actually a perfect segue to say that Suffolk University is now enrolling an applied data science master's program. So I don't know if they have that degree or not. So our next presenter, I'll pull up, is Dr. L.J. Medenica. He's an assistant professor in the MPA program at the University of Alaska Southeast. And just as a quick note, I actually might miss one of these stops. He told me earlier that his trip here was Juneau to Seattle, Seattle to Chicago, Chicago to Boston. So as someone who lives in the Northeast, I'm bathing in the privilege of a 45-minute flight here from Newark this morning. So please welcome and give a big round of applause and appreciation for Dr. L.J. Medenica.
Thank you very much. My head is still spinning from Jason's formulas and models, or maybe that's jet lag, I don't know. It's really hot here in Boston. I will switch your attention to a little bit softer things like culture, and I will focus my presentation on nonprofits in Alaska. So let's start with a few numbers. We have 8,000 nonprofits in Alaska. Last year recorded total assets $14 billion. Last year reported total income $8 billion. Big numbers, big driving force for the economy too. But all those nonprofit organizations, they need to be much more effective. They need to use, to strive to achieve performance excellence, to attract new additional finance supports in those new conditions today. Decreased budgets, decreased government support, more competition on the market among various organizations, new generations, new habits, new technologies, new cultures, and so on. So they really need to pay attention on the fact that passion that those people have, it's not enough anymore. You need to really be more effective. And the problem is they don't know what is it. They don't know what to do and how to do it. So I will talk a little bit about that, especially what they can learn from business world. And as Professor Holzer mentioned, I won't use productivity and profit and all those other wild words. So let's see, can we go there? So when we are talking about performance management, first thing that we will have in our mind is operational efficiency, organizational performance, I can see here, accountabilities, evaluations, and so on. So that's all what we know. But there is one big difference when we are thinking about those challenges and those benefits in the nonprofit world. They're more about effectiveness. And effectiveness depends on organizational performance, but it's a broader concept and more focused on relations. Operational performance are more focused on outputs, some administrative systems, some numbers, financial reports, for example. In nonprofit world, that's a little bit different, and I will try to explain how it's important to align all those specifics in nonprofit world with performance management approach, with strategic management, and so on. So it's obviously that what we heard from our guest speaker, Troy, he really explained from practitioner's point of view that foundation, how the making a different culture is essential. So everybody is clear, culture is so important. Performance management is so important, but those are words from famous Peter Drucker, that culture eats strategy for breakfast. There is some innovation with that, for lunch and for dinner too. Because if you do not have right culture, you cannot implement your strategy. If you do not have culture that is supporting performance management, you cannot implement effective performance management. So this is the question that I faced in my career in both business and public service world. I worked as management consultant. I had one amazing opportunities to be asked to implement what I advised, so I was on both sides of the table. I worked for United Nations Developer Program, advising some governments developing their organizational capacities and so on. But today my students are facing the same question, that misalignments between strategy and culture, and what we can do with that. So let's see. One graph that is showing how there are so many dimensions there that we need to think about. We have those three levels in every organization: individual level, group, team, program level, and organization-wide level. We have each of those levels has its own key factors. On the individual level, we have expectations, we have motivation, and so on and so on. We can see overlapping performance management with strategic management, for example. And we can see how all those elements need to be intervened. Performance management is not a standalone venture. It's not standalone trip towards certain goals. It's combined with all those. So it's important to understand, and we all know that nonprofit, what they're doing, what government or business world cannot do. So they're providing valuable services, but not always profitable. Sorry for that word. So they cannot use approach that businesses are working, financial effects, and they're good. They need to be more focused on relations of outputs. So businesses are more focused on outputs, and nonprofits are more focused on outcomes. So when you will see this, when you are seeing this graph, it's all well-known things. We are all starting with vision, mission, some values, principles, building strategy, building goals, and go on, developing foundation for activities. And those activities provide results. And after that, we need to use those results as feedback to align, to improve, to adjust strategy and all those other elements and so on. So this is all very well known. But obviously, high performance culture is very important part of that and as a key success factor. But what are driving forces? We know that too. We know all those elements, how there are important client satisfaction, program effectiveness, operating efficiency, service quality, how this is intervened with strategic planning, performance, and so on and so on. So we all know that. But the focus here is on organizational culture that is supporting those driving forces. So, am I done with the time? So, what is scary here? Stanford Graduate Business School released a survey among 1,000 board members from 1,000 nonprofit organizations. And let me see the numbers. 1/3 of those nonprofit directors are not satisfied with the board's ability to evaluate the performance of the organization. Half of those board members, half of surveyed 1,000 people, have little or no confidence that the data that they review fully and accurately measure the success of their organization in achieving its mission. That's scary. In Alaska, it's even worse. So it means those board members are not aware how much they need performance management, what is there, which kind of elements they need to address, and so on and so on. So we are facing here so-called third sector paradox. They need to be more effective. To be more effective in financial management, in operational management, it's a good idea to use some proven tools from the business world, adjusted, transformed, transferred to nonprofit world. But they're scared that they will lose their soul, nonprofit soul, using anything from the business world. So that's that kind of paradox that is actually making things hard. And Troy mentioned that it's extremely important to have that buy-in on the top level. So only board of directors, if they will buy in that, if we can educate them, train them, they can spread the message and trigger the actions and so on. So I didn't share beer with Troy, but we had same words, and you will see now in following slides that he presented as his experience. Actually, I took some foreign beer last night, and it looks like mess up my accent. Sorry about that. So let's go forward. When we are talking about building healthy organization, we need to master those key behaviors that will make that organization successful. And what is the foundation? Trust, building trust. And what is next step? Managing differences, mastering conflict, talking about differences in approaches, what to do, how to do. And when we'll discuss all that, and when we can achieve commitment, we can now talk about accountability. And after that, without anything anymore about organizational policy and what are our disagreements and so on, we can be focused on the results. So being focused on the result is actually leading towards the success. But doing this is not HR thing. Developing those behaviors is not something that is a standalone project. This needs to be embedded with strategic planning, with strategic management, and all those other elements that we had in some of those previous slides. So how we can think about some logic model that is actually presenting that result approach specific for nonprofit organizations. This first part is common for everybody, for also any organization, because we have inputs, some activities, we have outputs. But in nonprofit world, as I said, we cannot talk about outputs. We need to talk about outcomes and their effects on society, on communities, and so on and so on. So many times those outcomes, because they need to represent a mission and mission-based goals, we can start from that and plan backwards what we need as inputs to go further. And on the end, what donors are actually expecting from nonprofits in which they're donating their work, their money, their capital, and so on. They're expecting actually long-term outcomes. They're expecting impact. So how we can create a high-performance culture? We can go through those 5 phases. Analyzing what it looks like now, what we wish to see as desired culture. We should map those differences, try to make some action plan, and after that to measure behaviors and other things that are, as a result, changes that we wish. And Troy explained that very well. His example is excellent. And basically, he went through many of those steps, sharing success story, motivating employees, and so on. So I really do not wish to quote part of his presentation, but this is actually real world, something that practitioners share with us. And what is important is to allow others to learn about that. So when we started to talk with board members in many nonprofits, and when my students started to, as board members or members of some nonprofit, when they tried to introduce those new stuff, transfer from business world, we started with very simple strategic maps. And this was very important because, as Troy mentioned, many of those business plans, strategic plans are collecting dust somewhere, but presenting business strategic plan on one page, and that's something that Kaplan developed in the 90s, is actually very effective because you have those major perspectives about learning and innovation and growth for the employees, for themselves. After that, internal processes, how to be more effective. After that, how customers are, what is their perception of what we are doing. And at the end, we need to deal, of course, with some financial health issues, because to support mission-based goals, you need to be financial healthy. So there are needs to talk about profit. And of course, we need to have our employee satisfaction, and we need to have the public stakeholders' perception. So the point is that using those and similar other tools, balanced scorecard and so on, from business world, we actually managed to introduce to board members some useful techniques that they can make their activities better. This is from a real project, the consulting project, Liquid Adaptive scheme. We combined here strategic initiatives, organization capacity, performance culture, with those strategic map issues. Each strategic map should serve only one strategy. And then we had that logic model, results logic model. So we are actually introducing results-based management from inputs, outputs, and on the end to impacts. And in conclusion, all of you are here professionals, and you know all of that. But as I said, it's very disturbing and almost scary to see how those great, passionate people in many nonprofit boards actually don't know what to do and how to do it when they're talking about performance management. So we actually started introducing some concepts to them, helping them to understand some of those elements that I briefly went through. And after that, they can learn about those key elements, how to implement those, and after that, building that high-performance culture is actually a result from all those activities. And Troy actually really presented all that as his example, what I went through here. So to conclude, the point is that performance management is essential. It's a surviving tool for nonprofits today, but they're not equipped to implement this. And the first action step that we can do it is to help those board members to understand some of those tools that they can use and should use to be more effective. And this is essential, critical for them, because only in that way they can attract financial support, they can attract quality board members, and they can attract volunteers, and they can make better connections and contacting with community, with government, and so on. So this was my small story from Alaska, what we are doing, trying to help nonprofit organizations and their board members to understand what we are talking here without blocking them with big systems and data and concepts and formulas, because they need to grasp this first. Thank you very much.
Okay, last but not least, we have Roland Stark. He's a statistician and research consultant at Integrative Statistics. He received his BA from Harvard in medieval history, which is super cool, and his master's in education from Boston College in educational research, measurement, and evaluation. So, do you want this mobile mic here?
I'll use the double.
All right.
There's a handout in your conference packet that you can follow along if you like. I'm here hoping that you can all learn from my mistakes others have made with regard to analysis. First of all, I want to talk about causation and the way it gets confused with correlation, but more generally, issues about causation and ways in which people struggle and get it wrong. Am I loud enough, soft enough? Okay. There's a great little nugget coming out of banking research that the best predictor for whether a person will repay their loan is whether they use those little felt protectors on the bottoms of the feet of their furniture. So, as I'm sure you've seen, there are bank officials traveling the country distributing felt. You've seen this? Okay, so it's extremely easy to fall prey to that little trap, which is not much of a trap, but imagine it in analogous situations, thinking that because something's connected, it's convenient enough to believe that it must be the cause. Why not jump to believing that? But it's always worth taking extra time, putting in extra effort to discover whether something really is a cause and not just statistically associated. And I strongly advocate that in your organization, when you're struggling with a causal conundrum, ask everybody you can, not just the most educated people, not just the high status people. Find what everybody thinks about the situation and what might be responsible for the outcome that you see. Other people you might not have dreamed will come up with great ideas about nuisance variables or confounding variables. A couple of situations involving causation. You've probably all thought about and run across situations like one group of students gets remedial tutoring, one group doesn't. The first group still does poorer on exams than the other. So why could that be? Of course, they started out at a different place. Similarly, psychotherapy patients do more poorly on scores on depression than those who don't receive psychotherapy. Of course, they started out in a different place. We often want to, well, we would love to be able to use randomization to assign people to groups and thus get a really clean, isolated estimate of what's really the cause and the effect here. Randomization is so beautiful for that, experimentation. But we seldom can do that. We're dealing with real life situations that occur. We've got to deal with pre-existing groups. So what we often resort to is to use statistical control to try to balance out. Two groups are uneven, but we think if we take into account their pre-existing differences, what their characteristics are, their preparation, we'll find ways to make these differences even out or reverse themselves to the point where we can see a benefit that we want to see. Statistical control is very inventive. It's been around for probably 90 years. It's not infallible, and it's worth taking the time to think through the way that we use it. So we all have these great statistical programs now on our computers, and you can point and click and write code, but the software doesn't know if you're trying to control for things in a way that's actually bizarre. If you're trying to test the effect of a fertilizer and you give the corn plants the fertilizer and you keep the tomato plants as controls, the question you're answering is how high would the corn plants have grown if they had been tomato plants? Okay? When the pre-existing differences are large enough, it's not reasonable to try to use control to even them out, to adjust for them or control for them or account for them. It's not reasonable. The software won't tell you. You've got to think it through. You've got to get your colleagues to think it through with you. Can I use control here? Are these groups reasonably comparable? And there's no absolute bright line saying that's comparable and that's not. You've got to think it through, maybe use pre-existing literature. Another somewhat thornier topic, I was working with a group of hospitals, and under the Affordable Care Act, hospitals are paying close attention to preventing 30-day readmissions. Some patients they send home having assigned a visiting nurse, a visiting physical therapist, or generally home health services. And those patients do worse on readmission measures. Not a real surprise to you all, right? But what if you could control for their background? How severe was their illness in the first place? How many times have they been to the hospital in the past year? How long was their stay? You find that when you control for these things, you get better and better approximations of almost even, but still, the home health services group does worse. Still worse. You can't control your way out of it. And this is the topic of a paper I was helping with. So you can't always get an answer. Control doesn't always lead you to the promised land, Yellow Brick Road. And it just takes a lot of thought and a lot of collaborative thinking and brainstorming. One note about the cartoon on page 2 is that, I'll give you a second to look at it. The word imply there is kind of misleading, because imply can mean both necessitate, require, and suggest. Almost opposite things. So I wouldn't use imply if I were you when talking about the relationship of correlation and causation. Okay, pitfall number 2, overemphasizing statistical significance, neglecting the size of an effect. First of all, how many people feel comfortable they got a good grasp of what statistical significance is all about? Okay, it's worth my taking a little time to review this. If you get a result coming out of a research study like the letter P, P is less than 0.05, it's saying a very indirect but potentially somewhat useful statement. You can't get the direct statement you want. You want to know, how likely is it that my results are legitimate, not random, but legitimate, genuine? You can't get that. Don't even try. Give up. What you can get is this indirect statement. If chance were creating two groups like the groups you're looking at, here's how likely a result like this would be. Oh, less than 0.05, 0.02? Okay, pretty unlikely. It happens just 2% of the time if chance is operating. So I guess I'll sort of work my way towards believing that my results are kind of genuine. You can't get more direct than that. That's just the life of somebody working with statistical significance. But anyway, you hear tons of results that say such and such is significant, this group difference or this correlation between variables or what have you, without telling how big is the connection. Is it 1% better here? Is it 600% better? You always should be demanding what's the effect size from people. Don't settle for what most of these newspaper articles tell you, which is it's significant. Not helpful. And even more helpful is if you can get a confidence interval where you say, I think our best guess is this group is 3 points better than that group. Could be as low as 1, could be as high as 5. There's my confidence interval. It tells a lot more than just saying the 3 by itself, and it certainly tells more than statistically significantly better, which is so empty. So you should be producing them in your work, and you should be demanding them in others' work. How much time do I have? Pardon? Okay, great. Pitfall number 3, waiting too long to consult a statistician. It's okay if it's not me. Don't worry, I'm not trying to be that way. A lot of what we do in this field is psychometric, trying to figure out what's in people's minds, skills, opinions, preferences, knowledge. So survey work pretty often. And when you do survey work, it's very easy to slip into thinking that what you get back is pretty much the real McCoy. But if you look at the pie chart on page 3, This is actually the real deal. There was a lot of great research that went into this tiny little pie chart showing that of the three kinds of information you could characterize coming out of surveys, the one we want, the valid info, the signal, is just less than half of what we get. And there's sizable amounts that are biased, in other words, distortion, people trying to promote, look a certain way, promote a certain image for themselves, or people just getting things wrong, having wrong information. Any of that can be bias, distortion. And then finally, noise, which is sort of imprecision, people forgetting to mark the right checkbox, or just sort of things that wouldn't necessarily replicate themselves next time, but they're imprecise. They interfere with the clarity of our measurement. So between these two things, these two lower things, they make up a hefty amount of the information that we get back. So it's very good to have expert advice on things like how to make our indicators, our measures, as valid and reliable as possible. Example, you want to ask a question as a yes/no. Turns out you might get advised, break it out into more possibilities than that. Maybe it's on a scale. Maybe you can get good information. Or maybe the opposite is true. Maybe you're asking something with 10 different possible answers, and you might get advised, you know what, you're not even going to use the 1 through 7 anyway. People aren't going to use. They're all going to be focused on here. Let's just make it a yes, no, and clean it up. These things can be evidence-based decisions that you make as you go into designing a survey. A lot of us work with very soft or complex constructs, okay? Self-efficacy, which is so overused, but, or satisfaction or trust, all on the softer side. These things are better off measured with multiple survey questions or items. It's very shaky to trust one question and have that be your indicator for somebody's level of trust. How to do that, how to take the 5 or 3 or whatever number of component questions and zip them up into a single scale score for trust can be something that a statistician will be very informative about doing in a way that's going to be as reliable and valid as possible. Before you collect your data, mind you, so it's while you're designing the whole thing. There was a great statement that the reason to consult a statistician after you collect data is to conduct a postmortem, figure out what the experiment died of. So early on is helpful. When you use grids in surveys, long lists of lots of rows and columns, there are times when the grid is very effective and there are times when it's not, and you should break it up into individual questions with the individual spaces for the answers. And this, again, is evidence-based, and there's a reference at the bottom of your sheet about that if you're interested from recent survey journal. I'm going to move on. Another portion about consulting a statistician involves power. Statistical power, you see the logo here, it was co-opted by somebody else, but if there's an effect out there to be found, you want to find it. You want to have large enough sample, precise enough measurement, and all the other things that go into power so that you'll be able to say, yes, we've got a significant result. And you can impress your clients, your stakeholders, your funders with your statistically significant result, which you will accompany with the effect size. It's terribly wasteful to conduct a study, and at the end of it, all we can say is such a milquetoast statement, this wide confidence interval. We can't say anything very precise because our power was so low. I worked for a group of school districts in the Southwest. They had a great plan, test technologies on their buses to see if they can improve safety. They figured we'll use 50 buses in each of 4 groups, control group, Tech 1, Tech 2, Tech 3. 50 buses for the entire school year. We'll have lots of data. It should be plenty. Some statistical power analysis showed they needed 20 times that much data. And if you don't believe me, think about how rare accidents are and how difficult it is to show the difference between the rare and the extremely rare, because they wanted to move from rare to extremely rare. You need huge sample sizes and all the other power components that you can read about. that I'll tell you about. They're fun. So in that case, they would have spent $750,000 on that study, and they would have had a 14% chance of getting something usable out of it. So it was definitely a plus to think it through early before committing. And that's all I got.
Okay, so we have like 20-ish minutes for questions from the audience.
My question is for Jason. So I work in city government, and I've never heard of the two terms you discussed today. It's very interesting. You discussed, I believe it was with DEA, that you could talk about modeling, changing the inputs, and how that would affect the outcomes. Is there more research that we should do about that, and whether that predictive modeling has proven true in the long run?
Yeah, so DEA has lots of, it's an old methodology, came out in the late 70s, early 80s to think through schools, because schools have lots of different inputs, teachers and books and staff, and lots of different outputs, right? Like not only just one test score, but 5 test scores. So there's a big body of literature that you can sort of lean on for that, and it's been done in a number of different sectors. In terms of like the productivity of each dollar, SFA is actually probably a more useful tool. So, but both have big bodies of literature. I mean, thousands of papers, tens of thousands in both cases that has been used in. My own. No, I'm happy to talk with you offline about sort of about where to look. There are a couple of, depends on the sector, right? For sure. But Stuart Bretschneider, who's at Arizona State now, has done some work in performance management and using DEA and some other computing. So, but we can. I'll be happy to sort of throw some papers out for sure.
It seems like it collapses all outputs into a single variable. Like how useful would that be in a applied setting?
Yeah, not really. If you can't, right? So, which is why DEA is the more popular methodology for like public and nonprofit sector management. Unless what you can do with SFA is sort of break it out into, you could run 4 different SFAs for every output, for instance, right? If you have different outputs, you typically will have sort of different production functions in the sense that different things will go into making them, right? So you could say, how much food did I make? But it would probably make more sense to go, how many eggs I used to make a cake? How much cheese I used to make this casserole, right? So you can sort of break them out into sort of each criteria that you're sort of responsible for measuring performance on, to think through the inputs and outputs. But typically DEA is used if you really want to benchmark performance and you've got a lot of things you need to consider. DEA is in my opinion, the more useful tool.
Another question for you. Were any decisions made based on the results of your study?
At
think it was about the
Habitat, no.
housing.
At Habitat, yeah, we haven't presented the data yet to them. We probably should. But I think so. This stuff's tricky though. So when we've worked with organizations in the past, when I've worked with organizations in the past, I did a lot as a grad student on sort of presenting folks. I found anyway that the organizational culture matters more. I mean, I spent an hour up there saying, do more of this and less of this, and if they didn't strategically think that was the direction, often that data got tossed, shredded with the whatever else they shred in Chicago, where I'm from. So, yeah, so I think the culture is important for sure. I don't know how receptive Habitat will be, but I think just gave us this data like, yeah, if you want it, you can have it. I don't think they intended anything particularly useful with it, but we'll see when we talk with them.
Hi, I'm Lauren Hajar. I'm here with the Institute for Public Service, and my question is for Dr. LJ. I'm interested to know if you've thought about, I think we can all agree that, conflict management and trust and shared rewards and accountability and performance measurement systems are important and contribute to a high-performance work system, but I'm wondering if you've thought about a systematic methodology for how to get from here to there in the public or nonprofit sector.
You need to push this? No, you just talk. Thank you for your question. I mean, the reality is that 80% of nonprofit organizations that I have chance to review in some way or with my students actually do not have even a strategic plan. They are working last 20, 30 years in the same way, driven by their passion. They're great people. They're providing great services for homeless, for this, for that, and they're continuing in that way. But now they're really facing a new reality, reduced fundings, competition, new generations that wish to push button on their cell phone to donate, not to go to somebody's office and so on. So many challenges. And we figure out that, to ask them to sign up for our Master of Public Administration program. They do not have time and they do not wish to do that. So we figure out, let's start with simple steps. Let's introduce them to the situation. Let's make them aware that they need to be more effective, and let's try to support them, including our students who were actually already members there, knowing some of those things that I try to go over so fast and present, just as showing you how actually without long, elaborated methodologies, just a practitioner's approach, just to let's make progress, not perfection.
Hi, I'm Spencer Bryan from the Naval Postgraduate School. My question's for Julie. So I teach public budgeting, and whenever I teach my students, public financial management is about converting this raw data from these systems into useful information that can guide managerial decisions. And often, that class is about, understanding financial statements but I'm preparing a curriculum for a new course on, understanding a lot of these big budgetary models that the DoD uses, and so I just am interested in kind of what are your thoughts on how do we teach, our MPA students how to consume data coming out of these big systems and the greater pace and availability of data. What changes do you think you might expect in teaching public financial management in the future?
I've found some interesting papers that incorporate econometric ideas and trying to use different data or large data to try to extract useful information. That's where I've seen most of it. But I feel that I am behind the 8 ball on trying to figure out either what students need to know or just the basics of how to talk to an expert statistician or somebody about what's available in the data to try to put it together to extract it. Now, I could not find the information, but it seems to be there with like the Bloomberg Initiative, where they work with individual cities, where individual cities do data training as well. But my next step is trying to figure out what is it that they teach and are we covering it? And I see a big gap right there. And I usually teach budget. I tell students take as many statistical courses as they can, but I also tell them I don't expect you to be an expert, but you need to be able to talk with the experts. And that's one of my personal frustrations there. There's one article I pulled up from Jane Futrell, who talked about kind of the toolbox of all the different programs available. And part of my problem is that there's information out there, but it's proprietary. different universities are selling their data program or this data program, the data training for different, they have one, the lean or whatever, it's internally for government right now, and if my students ask, I still don't have a clue. So this is trying to find out. I think that we are typically behind. And people who do research usually take a year or two to do the survey and then get it published. And so we're still behind there. And so I'm just not sure right now, and I'm still trying to work that one out. I found the CompuStat and performance stat type of information valuable to start out with a checklist. I think that, at least with my students, I'm emphasizing they need to have basic statistical literacy and understand that this is not a chief data officer, but it's a collaboration, and it has to be not just within one data office, but it has to be shared elsewhere. That's my current state of understanding right now. And as you can probably hear, I'm a little bit frustrated that I've got a lot to learn to be able to provide usable information for students. And I'm probably getting more information from them that are employed in the field of how it's being used than in publicly available materials.
Can I add one point to that? Is there books like the Freakonomics books by Levitt and Dubner and the Mastering Metrics book by Joshua Angrist that, rather than being stories from data necessarily, they're stories about using data? So how people went about attacking a problem with data. They're very instructive, and I recommend them for people that are in the position that you described.
Let me just pose a question to the panel. How do you bridge the gap of understanding between the sophisticated statistics you've all been talking about and the limited abilities of policymakers, say in the media, and many citizens to understand this? So all this good work is going on, and how do we actually increase the probability that there's going to be an impact in terms of the way policy is made and policy is interpreted, and against the background that many of our MPA students are adverse to statistics, in a sense. So how do we bridge that gap? Yeah.
That's why I linked it to policy sciences, the early promise of that we could get the data, analyze it, and provide very good policy results, and the ongoing frustration of if it's not provided in a story or usable. So I tend to argue Occam's razor. I tend to argue using graphs and charts, and if you pull the data, you have to have a clear question, and you have to have a narrative of explaining in college-educated terms of what you did and why it matters. And so I tend to emphasize it's not just the number crunching, it's the question asked, and why does this matter? Where do we go from here?
I guess I have a couple of thoughts on that. The first is, I probably don't even think that would. All right, there's better. The first is, I think others have noticed that gap too, and so there have been a couple of. So the conversation is a media outlet that does translational public policy work. So they sort of track down researchers who publish things and work with you. It's a real pain in the butt. But because we're not used to writing for, many of us are not used to sort of writing for, I don't know how to, the public, right? So they work with you over, it took me months to get like a 8-paragraph thing put together to sort of walk through how to translate what you found about how nonprofits are run to people who run nonprofits. So there's that. And the other part, I think, in the MPA programs is teaching. My MPA students I teach the stats stuff in my department, and they are really averse to it, as I have to explain when I'm explaining my teaching evaluations to my P&T committee. But right, but part of it is sort of walking through how to use the stuff, right? So it's less for me about mastering the technology, but understanding things like causality, right? And when you don't have it and why you don't have it. And so we'll sort of walk through basic examples, like we have one where we're like predicting who died on the Titanic and sort of thinking through the other, we had some data on that, which I thought was fun and they thought was dark. But we had some data on like who died and sort of where they were on the ship and all. And so like those examples and teaching with, well, what else could predict whether or not someone died on the Titanic, right? And so how much money they had and who was traveling to the United States in the early 1900s and why was the lower class part of the ship so much bigger than, right? And so using the data to sort of help our public agencies, the folks who are going to help run our public agencies, think through what data means has been, for me, an important part of what I think teaching in the MPA program means. So I think they're media outlets, but then I think teaching, for me anyway, has been a useful venue for training myself to better sort of walk through actual solutions with data.
I will say that we are actually dealing here with different targets, with different market groups, let's say in that way. A big organization, if they have resources, experts, knowledge, skills, they can deal with everything what you're talking about. But when we are dealing with smaller organization and all together they're dealing with a lot of money and a lot of services and a lot of valuable outcomes, they you know what they told me? Please, when I was consultant, please don't bring any professor because they're always, above our heads. And what we are seeing in reality is that sharing success stories from practitioners' point of view is actually the way to go, because they will understand that stories, they will be motivated by those stories, and they will start to use examples, small steps, numbers, data, because they have, of course, some of those. And this is, I think, what we are trying to do, start from the bottom, with some basics, educating, informing them, and sharing stories, success stories. And after that, they will start one by one step to use those things and go towards actually higher levels.
And along the lines of success stories, there are two people who have, in recent years, in psychology or behavioral economics, won the Nobel Prize.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think they're sufficiently promoted as heroes. And that's Daniel Kahneman and Richard Thaler. So it may be useful to, and their books are actually very accessible too.
If I could contribute to that so Greg, Greg Van Ryzen and Javier, and we're doing some experimental work on like motivated reasoning and interpreting data. So like you can present people with the same underlying data, for example, comparing agency A versus agency B, and they do the mathematics correctly. But if you say fire department EMS versus private contracted EMS, they consciously do the mathematics wrong to sort of enforce their own heuristics and their own biases. But the way you can moderate that almost completely is using appropriate data visualization. So instead of presenting a basic table of numbers where people have to do mathematics themselves and interpret and figure out which is correct, you just present a bar chart or a line graph, and it completely moderates those effects of all those cognitive shortcuts people take. And we see that in prospect theory with Kahneman. If you use data visualization rather than putting numbers, just two numerical numbers against each other, it completely moderates the effect of people making the incorrect decisions. And I think probably in like applied statistics class and applied research design or MPA programs, we focus a little. We don't focus enough on the effective presentation of the data once we complete the program evaluation. It can be pretty powerful tools.
On the IBM Business of Government, Jeannie Stowers has a paper on data visualization that's interesting to look at.
I think on data visualization that maybe the best models are looking at the the visualizations that are used in the popular media. The New York Times, for example, is very good on this stuff. Maybe too good sometimes. You have to really hunt for the keys sometimes. Or the magazines. I mean, Bloomberg Business Week, or for example. So You know, there is a movement in that direction. I think we need to bring it more into the public and nonprofit sectors.
So one last thing on the challenge, it'd be interesting to sort of hear from, as the days go on, how the folks resolve. Like, one thing that's still challenging for me is sort of getting, when we're working with agencies and nonprofit managers, what kind of data they actually want, right? So I find that often what's communicated to me and my team is somewhat different than I think what they actually want, right? Like, so there's a Department of Transportation that may or may not be in the state in which I work that is sort of putting our RFP out asking for some benchmarking. But after sort of talking around the folks in the community, I'm finding out what they actually really want is just a database to show they're spending all of their money, right? And so that's a different tool that I could maybe help provide with some other folks, but it's a little bit hard sort of translating how what we did is useful if the goals are sort of mismatched. And so I think better communication on our end as researchers, but also from the agencies and the nonprofits that we work with about what the strategic goals of whatever data project or performance management project are, could certainly help sort of bridge that gap and help get on the same page at the outset.
Okay, that's the end of our time for this panel. Let's give our panel one final round of applause. Thank you very much.